Everybody, we're back in session, and just as a housekeeping note, I have a late statement which is one that I knew about and agreed, so it's not a surprise in that sense, and it's from Cuckfield Parish Council on matter 3.3, so it's not for today, on site SA23 land at Hamleys Court, Cuckfield. So talk to the programme officer if you need to know more about that or get it online. So coming back to the scope of the plan, I don't know whether Tondra Todd had more to say, because I'd rather cut her off with my stomach calling. But does Tondra want to say any more?
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Sorry, I'm just going to get my video. Sorry, it's a bit technical. Yes, thank you. I guess on question one, really just if aim 4 is indeed to set out additional strategic policies, then this scope, as I mentioned, is outside of the scope of the district plan, and it would appear to be also not in accordance with national policy, NPPF paragraph 22, which requires 15 years from adoption for strategic policies. It needs to policies need to be really clear which are strategic, and those that are should have 15 years from adoption. So on 2 counts, it seems that aim 4 is not appropriate for a daughter document and part 2 site allocations plan. That was the end really for point 1 of 1.2. Thank you.
Right, we'll put that point to the council in a minute, but I just want to see, I'll invite anybody else who wants to speak on this aspect of the scope. Graham Keane, do come in. Good afternoon, Graham Keane.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Sorry, just got a little feedback thing going on here. Apologies. It's bad enough hearing myself once without having it echoing back at me.
Comment on that.
Yeah. So just to say, I mean, you'll have seen the written representations put in on behalf of my clients by Belle Williams on this aspect of the question, and it's really to just to step in, because the allocation of the science park under SA9 is one of the 4 aims, just to take the opportunity very briefly to reiterate my client's position that the scope of the plan is in line with the aims and the strategy of the district plan, particularly, of course, in regard to the SDP. And it allows the site allocations DPD, this document, to identify locational specific policies, which is important given that a preferred location for the STP has been identified now, following the call for sites, the regulation 19 stage, and indeed an assessment of the reasonable alternatives as part of that process. So I've already referred earlier to the raft of detailed technical evidence that underpins the allocation. I won't say any more about that for now, because we'll obviously come back to the STP in detail under matter 5, but just really at this point to emphasize that the STP is a major element of the district council's planning objectives for the district, and the proposed nature and scale of the allocation will provide a critical mass to deliver a real catalyst for change. And that's important, sir, as ever, but particularly now perhaps in terms of helping economic growth and quality of jobs in the district and the wider region, particularly relevant in a time, hopefully, as we're coming out of the pandemic, when central and local government both seek investment in infrastructure and to boost economic opportunities and growth. So the reason, therefore, the need for a detailed policy framework is very apparent to ensure investor and occupier confidence of delivery, and of course to assess and assist in the assessment of a planning application in due course. And so this is, of course, this allocation is the only deliverable site to achieve that DPD aim, that main aim. So it is it's my client's case that's entirely consistent and compliant with the fundamentals of paragraph 35 of the framework, in terms of positive preparation, effectiveness, justification, and compliance with policy. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. Right, Juan Lopez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Just to touch upon then the employment land-based objective, our matter statement 1.2. So you'll see if you want to take a pen note that it is encased within our SA19 and SA20 allocations objections. Of course, we'll come to those principally under matter 3, but just to flag now, because there is an overlay which we did attempt to bottom out, but I think it is engaged here. And so also a further flag on our 1.2.1 second bullet. So for your pen, you asked about how one approaches or defines communities in terms of the quote of to provide opportunities for people to live and work within their communities, reducing the need for commuting. Well, that gives rise to infrastructure first concern to see that sufficient land, employment land, is allocated within adequate proximity of any allocations within the area of SA19 and 20. And with that then takes us to 1.3.2, which is the nuts and bolts of the concern. Whilst the DPD is allocating a further 772 homes to East Grinstead, it doesn't allocate any local employment space. We don't see within the evidence base that's been presented so far any reason justification for that sort of an approach. And again, please mark, sir, that we have inquired and we think of the correct officers. And can I just explain as well that those inquiries were made before Infrastructure First was constituted as a local objector body. So one shouldn't think that the validity of those inquiries started from the date of our constitution. There was a matter that was raised by Ms. Lamb, I recall, this morning in relation to matter 1.1. It came in late, but it was made almost to the effect that we couldn't make a representation preceding the constitution, the date of constitution of our body. That's not the point we've been making under 1.1 or indeed now. These points were being flagged before officers, before Infrastructure First was constituted. So we've looked back at the evidence base in support of the approach for not allocating any adequate employment land space, indeed none, within reasonable proximity of these proposed allocations, and we're yet to see it. So that is a fundamental concern of ours, because otherwise it will dovetail or feed into the objection, our headline objection in relation to transport matters. So that's our 1.2. So.
Thank you very much. Right, I've got Oliver Bell next, if you'd like to take the floor.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, Oliver Bell from Nexus Planning on behalf of Miller Homes Limited. Yeah, just picking up on, in response to your question 1.2 Roman numeral 1, which you would have seen in our matter statements, we answer is no. And I think in your brief summary of the points that we'd raised, we agree that they're best dealt with through matter 3, but I think I just wanted to highlight a few points at this initial stage.
Okay.
Just picking up on the point that the council had raised, I think we fully accept that the site allocations plan is a daughter document, and that provides some degree of framework as to how you look to allocating sites and determining what the housing figure shall be. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the supporting text to policy DP4 of the district plan states that the submitted plan must allocate sufficient sites to meet the residual minimum housing requirement of the district and also maintain a 5-year housing land supply. So there's two elements there. And obviously, beyond determining what the residual figure is beyond sort of basic maths, there's obviously needs to be a judgment made in terms of how robust delivery assumptions are, the nature of allocated sites, for example, lead-in times, and some allowance given to non-implementation. And the council have acknowledged this to some degree in the context of a submitted plan, where they include a limited buffer. But as far as I can see, what they haven't done is they've not given any consideration as to whether any additional allocations should then be made to increase flexibility and robustness against the what are quite significant assumptions for the remaining commitments within the district plan. In our matter 3 statement, we've then in turn raised questions or concerns about delivery assumptions associated with a number of the committed sites. And that then in turn presents some challenges which we'll come on to tomorrow in terms of demonstrating the role in housing land supply over the remainder of the plan period, which of course is a requirement of the submitted plan. So I think it's just a marker really say at this point that our concern is that at this point in time, the submitted plan fails to set out a strategy that provides the confidence that the overall minimum housing requirement can actually be met and delivered in full over the remaining plan period.
Okay, thank you for that, and we'll go into that more detail tomorrow, I'm sure. Katie Lamb.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to come back to the point that Mr. Lopez on behalf of Infrastructure First is making, that indeed the housing policies of SA20 and SA19 can't be sustainable and meeting the objectives of the plan on the basis that they're not delivering employment, or that there is a failure to allocate employment sites nearby. I think that would need to be based on the evidence that there is inadequate employment already existing in East Grinstead, and indeed SA20, the land west and south of Imberhorn Upper School, is adjacent to Birch's industrial estate, and there are other employment opportunities in the area along Imberhorn Lane itself, the hotel at Felbridge, for example, and also that's not the only key demonstration of sustainability. We are building a sustainable, or offering a sustainable community here, one that delivers not only housing but education in the form of playing fields, and a primary school, which indeed in itself will offer employment opportunities. A community hub with the opportunity for health facilities, both again being able to offer employment opportunities, and this is the strategic SANG as well, and the care facility, which also could deliver more employment opportunities. And these should all be considered in the round, that that it is delivering a sustainable community, but also importantly and critically on the edge of a category 1 settlement, the most sustainable settlements in the district. And this is also within walking and cycling distance of the town centre, the train station, and a myriad of bus stops and services as well. So I question how it couldn't be a sustainable community, and I question why it can only be that if another employment allocation was to be allocated nearby. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucy Wilford, please.
Thank you. I'll be brief because I know we're dealing with the kind of needs case tomorrow, but quite simply, the issue of needing to address the need for specialist accommodation has already been deferred, as it were, from one local plan, the current adopted local plan, until this site allocations document that's been effectively achieved through DP 25 and DP 30. Not dissimilar to the approach with DP1 for employment, which look to this document to address identified needs. The council has acknowledged there is a need for leasehold extra care, that being private extra care. And as I've already set out, national policy takes us beyond purely a numerical exercise in terms of the number of homes that we are delivering, but the types of homes we are delivering. So quite simply, the scope of this plan in the context of the adopted local plan should have included the need for and planned for the provision of specialist accommodation.
Thank you. David Murray Cox next, please.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, this is the Crawley point again, but just to put a little bit more meat on the bones, if that's okay. It's a fundamental component of the district plan that this district council seeks to support the needs of the adjoining authorities, namely Crawley and Brighton. And we know from Crawley's Regulation 19 consultation on their new local plan, which I think closed last week, that they have a continuing and growing unmet housing need. And we also know from the statements of common ground that Crawley have signed with the adjoining authorities that go around them, that there's very limited opportunities to help meet that need. They've agreed common ground with Mole Valley and Reigate and Banstead that those two authorities are unable to help. And the Tandridge local plan has been fraught with difficulties, as many participants to this session will know. That essentially leaves Horsham and Mid Sussex. And it's also a feature of both the district plan and this site allocations document that the council commits to continuing engagement with Crawley. And that's the right approach, we suggest, because the framework tells us that these issues should be dealt with rather than deferred. However, in the site allocations document, it essentially seems to have been set aside for a future date. What that means is that there's no mechanism currently in the emerging local plans which surround Crawley to deal with that issue. That's then compounded by the fact that the indicative minimum housing requirements of the various settlements in Mid-Sussex appear to have been treated variously as caps that can't be exceeded, although, as I said earlier, they have been in some cases. That then brings us into an issue which no doubt we'll speak about at another point in time, which is the availability of reasonable alternatives, because they've been discounted and the Crawley issue set aside. Thank you, sir.
Right, thank you for that. Right, I'm going to move on to the Court of Appeal that I mentioned, the Oxted Residential v Tandridge. We just mentioned Tandridge, so not a million miles away from this plan. And what the judgment said with the relationship between a main plan and a daughter plan, whether it's sound or not. And the comments I got back on that from the council, that it provides a clear and helpful clarification on the role of a supporting DPD, which, as the council say, the scope is clearly set out in the plan. Grace Machin for Burgess Hill Town Council and Softlag state that the aims and scope of the DPD should be broadened to include a consideration of its impacts on identified landscape and environmental assets. Well, they just mentioned that point actually. Barton Wilmore, the scope is flawed in failing to acknowledge and address the need to identify sites to meet the extent of significant need. And their approach is also backed by the MPPG. Parker Dan state that the scope does not accord with this judgment. How is it justified, they say, to revisit certain parts of the plan, e.g. SA 38, but not others? And they're saying that in fact policies SA 34 to 38 are indeed strategic in nature. And then finally, infrastructure group state that it's clear that the consultation process should be timely and accessible to all sections of the community. Well, yes. But I'm just wondering if anybody can go back into that judgment and see whether you feel this plan has been prepared in line with that judgment. Does anybody from the council want to help me on this to begin with? Mr. Brown.
Thank you. So yes, I mean, there's a lot of overlap between your, it's not a criticism, but there's a lot of overlap between your question one, is the scope of the plan in line with the main aims and strategy of the district plan? And question two, does the scope of the plan accord with the Court of Appeal? Because in essence, what the Court of Appeal tells you is that the scope of a site allocations plan will be defined by the district plan. And that's in essence what you've highlighted, that the passage from the judgment there, an inspector conducting an examination, in other words, you must establish the true scope of the development plan document he's dealing with and what it's setting out to do. Only then will he be able to properly judge whether or not within the scope it's sound. And so that, I think, it takes us back to your question one, And indeed, I think, well, as I've understood them, a lot of the contributions that you've just received just before lunch and since are really picking up on those sorts of points. I'm not sure at the moment. I mean, I'd like at some stage to come back on comments that were made by people a moment ago and just before lunch. But at the moment, I don't think I've got anything to add to what we've already said in relation to one on this issue, sir.
We've got no other hands at the moment coming up. And
Tom, sir.
therefore, you're very free to sort of indulge even more in your comments on the earlier comments, if you wish to. You're very welcome to.
Sorry, so was that directed at me or at others?
No, as I said, nobody else has yet got the hand up. You mentioned that you wanted an opportunity to come in.
Tom has a hand up, sir.
I'm sorry.
Tom,
I do beg your pardon. I've just seen Tondra Tom's hand, as it were. So let me bring in Tondra, please.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just picking up then on the council's answer to your question 1.2 and looking at the paragraphs from the judgment. They helpfully point out that the role of part 2 is not to rectify any shortcomings in their 2.7 relating to paragraph 2.8 of the judgment. I go back to their justification under aim 4, setting out new additional strategic policies. And one of those is to provide an update based on new air quality guidance. So it would seem like the current DP29 air quality policy, they are looking to rectify either shortcomings or update due to new guidance and policy, which this judgment specifically says, just simply because a core strategy may require an amendment, you can bring in a part 2 without seeking to amend that high level core strategy. And in fact, if you seek to do so, then where would you stop? At their paragraph 2.9, they advise the relationship between the district plan and the sites DPD is identical to the one described in this paragraph. And so I would like also then to take you to paragraph 39 of that judgment, where it says it supports the core strategy. Importantly, it says it does not substitute for the policies of the core strategy an amended or new strategy. This is not what it had to do, nor what it could have done. So how can it replace part of DP29 of the district plan? That is, in simplest terms, amending the higher level strategy. So as you know, Mr. Fox, I spent a couple of years on the Lewis Local Plan Part 2, and we had to really carefully define our scope and only deliver in Part 2 what the Part 1 plan said Part 2 would deliver. And it's quite clear in DP1 and DP4 what Part 2 here in this case is to do. It's to allocate sufficient housing, employment, and identify a specific site for the science park. It nowhere says it can introduce new strategic policies or update and amend existing policies in the district plan. So if it has dipped its toe over that line and stretched beyond that scope, where is the justification for just limiting it to those 5 policies? Why not bring in other issues? And I've heard a lot of mention of Crawley's unmet need, Brighton's unmet need. Lewis now has a terrifically high housing need. It's sort of over doubled since the plan's become 5 years old now. So they have an increasing housing need. Mid Sussex are surrounded by an area of very high unmet needs. So in having opened up the scope to this plan, why is it limited to what it is limited, and why can it not seek to bring in other strategic policies that will help to deliver sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I wonder if Paul Brown or somebody in your team.
I'll start, sir, and I'll dole out responsibilities for the bits that I don't know the answer to as we go along. So can I take you back to SOFLAG's comments just before lunch where the complaint was made that we're not in accordance with the aims and strategy of the district plan, and in particular, reference was made to the emphasis which is placed undoubtedly in the district plan on the protection of landscapes. And so it's absolutely right that the district plan does place a lot of emphasis on that. But so you will know, one has to read plans as a whole. And when you read what the district plan says about protecting landscapes, you also have to read it alongside what the district plan says, both about the need for housing and employment, and also about the distribution of housing and employment to meet that need. And self-evidently, to the extent that meeting the need will involve new greenfield sites, then there will be a degree of impact. And also to the extent that the district plan directs the SADPD to particular areas, then certain things go with that. And so that is highly relevant in terms of SOFLAG's particular concern. You know that they're particularly concerned about the concentration of development in and around Burgess Hill. Well, sir, that is exactly, and I do stress that word, exactly what the district plan says. And so, for example, if you look at page 30 of the district plan, it says in terms that housing development will be focused on Burgess Hill. So when you ask the question, are we within the scope of, are we in line with the aims and strategy of the district plan? I do ask you to read that or look at that question as a whole. So secondly, in terms of Tandra Tom's question in relation really to policies SA 34 to 38.
Yeah.
First thing that she says is, well, you know, are these strategic or not? Are we trying to hide something by taking the word strategic out of some of the supporting documents? Well, so the answer to that is we're not trying to hide anything. If we were, we've done a pretty rubbish job of it, because if you look at page 5 of the site allocations plan, it says under the heading development policies, district plan policies are complemented by 5 additional strategic policies. We've made no bones about the fact that those policies, 34 to 38, are in our view strategic. But sir, the answer in my submission to Ms. Tom's point is that the fact that they have a strategic ambit does not necessarily mean that they are out with or inconsistent with the aims and the strategy or the remit that was given to us by the district plan. There will be inevitably, when one is bringing allocations forward, matters which need to be addressed in bringing those sites forward. And it's entirely appropriate where those have a wider remit than simply each and every individual site, that we have a more general strategic policy that deals with it. And so, I mean, you could, for example, look at the way in which the individual allocations have happened. I mean, we could have written in to each and every one of those as an individual criteria requirements in relation to air quality. And if we'd done that, then Ms. Tom's criticism would disappear. But in substance, would that have changed anything at all? Answer, no, it wouldn't. You would still have a requirement in relation to air quality, which are applied across each and all of those developments. What we've done is isolated as a particular theme. It falls under the umbrella of a topic that's in the district plan. And so our approach, our belief has been that they are, as I say, within the scope of the district plan. So if we are wrong about that, and I stress the word if, because for reasons I've just outlined, I don't accept we are, I'd like you to think very carefully about where that goes, because if one looks at the objections that have been raised about SA 34 to 38, very few people, if anybody, is actually complaining about what we are trying to do under those policies. That is not actually the thrust of the objection that you are receiving. What instead you are getting is an argument that because they say those policies go beyond the scope of the district plan, we've lifted the lid on Pandora's box. And once you do that, well, where does it end? You should then be meeting the needs of Crawley and Lewis and everywhere else, and doing a whole load of other things as well. Well, sir, can I be very, very clear to you about the District Council's position on this? We have said time and again, this is a daughter document. We have said this is brought forward within the scope of the district plan, and it is not intended to go further. If for any reason you took the view that policies 34 to 38 do go beyond that proper remit, the council's position is not that that then suddenly gives everybody else license to argue that the site allocations document is unsound or is flawed because it doesn't do 65 other things as well. The council's response is, if you think 34 to 38 go beyond the proper remit, then the response is to recommend that those policies be taken out of the plan, because that would bring what the plan is doing into line with the judgment in Oxford. If you find, I stress the if you find that they do go beyond where it's supposed to be, it is not a proper basis for arguing that we should go back to the starting blocks and start looking at a whole load of needs which are not identified by the district plan, by the parent document. So if I then move on from that to points that were made by Juan Lopez in relation to East Grinstead, and in particular, he raises the question, why in circumstances where we are looking at something of the order of 770 new houses in East Grinstead, is there no employment allocation to meet that? And so I'm very grateful to Ms. Lamb for her contributions on that point. Points there very well made. I'm just going to turn, if I may, to Mr. Marsh to possibly make one or two additional points under that heading.
Thank you. In addition to Ms. Lamb's point about the proximity of existing employment sites in East Grinstead, so I'll take you to two things really. One being site selection paper 4. Site selection paper 4 outlines the selection process for employment sites within the sites DPD. And you'll note in there that there were, I think, 24 employment sites put forward to us during the call for sites process, none of which are in East Grinstead. However, we are allocating, my second point, I suppose, are allocating 2.7 hectares of employment land at Copbourne, which is on the A264 in very close proximity. And taking us back to the sustainability appraisal, the view of sustainability appraisal in picking up the most reasonable alternative was a spread across the district, and we've sought to achieve that as far as we possibly could, given the sites that we've had presented to us during the call for sites process, and then out to the other side of site selection paper 4 and determining what our preferred sites would be for the DPD.
Thank you. So if I can then come briefly to Mr. Bell's comments about the sufficiency of sites. And so to be fair, Mr. Bell is not suggesting that we should pick up needs that have not been identified in the district plan. I mean, he starts from the proposition he accepts that it's a daughter document, but in essence, what he says is, well, even to meet the needs of the district plan, you haven't gone far enough. I think that is an argument that is better dealt with under main matter 3, and we'll come back to that. But in terms of your question under 122, so even if, having heard main matter 3 discussion, you conclude that we haven't gone far enough, that doesn't indicate that what we have done is not in line with the district plan. Plainly, it is in line. We are seeking to meet needs that are identified by the district plan. If you conclude that we need more, then I'm sure you'll tell us so in due course, but it doesn't take us on the wrong side of the line of the Oxford judgment. And then the last matter that I wanted to respond to briefly is Mr. Murray Cox's comments about Crawley. And so this goes back to the points we've made about the daughter document status. The extent to which within the scope of this site allocations document, Mid Sussex should be meeting the need of Crawley was settled by the district plan. If more is now needed in the light of where Crawley is today, the place to pick that up is not the site allocations document. It will be the review of the district plan. And that is entirely consistent with the Oxford judgment. Indeed, any other conclusion would be inconsistent with that judgment. And in particular, sir, you will note in terms of the statement of common ground that we have with Crawley itself, that we have no complaint from them that we should now be picking up needs that they have identified since the date of the development plan. They are satisfied that we are proposing to do this as part of the district plan review. So unless Mr. Marsh wants to come in on anything else, and nobody's shaking his head at me, so those are the only points I make at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judith Aston, do come in.
Thank you, sir. Just really on that last point, if I may, in terms of the parent-daughter document issue, policy DP5 of the district plan clearly relates to planning to meet future housing needs and expressly refers to the duty to cooperate and the issues surrounding Gatwick Diamond and the West Sussex and Greater Brighton Strategic Planning Board and addressing the unmet needs of the sub-region. I was at the district plan examination, as were a number of other people on this call today, and the inspector at the time gave a lot of airtime to that issue, and it is referenced in DPD8, which is a supporting document to this examination. If we are dealing with a daughter document now, should it not then be dealing with DP5? And if not, why not?
So the very short answer provided by DP5 itself, and in particular the last paragraph of it, Council's approach will ensure that sites are considered and planned for in a timely manner, tested through a robust plan amendment process as part of a review of the plan starting in 2021 with submission to the Secretary of State in 2023. The review, not the daughter document, the review of the district plan.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll bring Richard Barmby in, if I may.
Thank you, Mr. Inspector. I'd just like to come back to the points on employment mentioned by Katie Lamb and then Andrew Marsh. To look back in context, the neighbourhood plans which were ploughed into the district plan as submitted took account of the needs of housing and employment in Mid-Sussex. During the course of the district plan examination, it was identified that there was an unmet need at Crawley. And as I understand it, as far as housing is concerned, the purpose of this allocations document is not to allocate Mid-Sussex's need, but the unmet need at Crawley. And this is to a certain extent borne out by the fact that there's no employment space proposed at East Grinstead in addition to what was proposed under the neighbourhood plan. And Mr. Marsh rather helpfully points out that there's no need for it because there's new employment space at Copthorne, which is adjacent to Crawley. So this all goes to the argument that, in fact, the houses at East Grinstead, the additional houses, are designed to meet Crawley's need and not East Grinstead, not Mid-Sussex need. And therefore, it comes into question whether it's the most suitable site. That's just the point I wanted to make.
Thank you for that. Before other people come in, I will let Mr. Marsh answer that. Seeing as I wouldn't say words are put in his mouth, but you certainly.
I'm glad you knew it was Mr. Marsh, sir, and not me.
Mr. Marsh.
Thank you. The site CPD is to meet the residual housing requirements across the district. There is no indication in the DPD or in the district plan that the additional or the residual amount is for Crawley on its own. That's not what we're saying. And secondly, on the employment point, I didn't say there was no need for employment at East Grinstead. I was simply stating that that the sites that we had put forward to us were the sites and through that source, and our review of the sites through site selection paper 4 didn't draw any sites from East Grinstead, so we couldn't allocate them.
Thank you for that. I'll move on. Tom, I think you're next on the list again.
Thank you. Just a quick point, sir. Just coming back on what Paul Brown said in relation to the daughter document and the fact that it contains strategic policies. The council's answer to matter statement 1 at 2.9 said it is through the district plan review process that strategic policies will be updated. So therefore, the updating of DP 29 through SA 38 is out with the scope of this plan, and arguably, as are the other strategic policies, SA 34 to 38. Thank you.
Did you say there, Ms. Tom, that all 5 policies are out with the scope, or just?
Well, I mean, I think the ones that identify infrastructure, it is hard to find a policy hook for those, and the council's answer does say they are to safeguard land for transport projects that are already within the pipeline. Now, that might just be the pipeline project planning. It's not evident that they're in the policy scope for the district plan, and that the policy hooks actually exist for these policies to flow from them. So I have a question mark over those, but I think particularly SA 38 that seeks to replace, that is then updating and amending district plan strategic policies. But for 36 and 37, whilst for 37, for example, whilst a multifunctional network is mentioned in the district plan, there is no clear policy hook for the allocation of land to deliver that, and it is a cross-boundary project with large parts of potential route within Lewes district. So I think those fit better within the district plan, what the district plan has envisaged for its own review rather than for its daughter document.
Okay. I think what I'd like from the council on this would be a note which looks at those 5 policies at the back of the plan, and which in a sense argues your case that it's right that they should be considered now and not at the review stage. I think that would be very helpful, because rather than have a bit more of a debate now, I'd like the council to take a long, cool look at this, having heard what people like Tom have said, to see whether in fact it is appropriate. I mean, SA 38, I guess, is the one which is most concerning me. But then again, 37, where we're talking about cross-boundary issues, again, there are clear strategic implications there. And how do they link in with the district plan itself? So I think that would be very helpful to have a note on that for me.
We'll do that, sir, and it may well be so that you get slightly different answers for the slightly different policies. I do stand before the mere fact that something has strategic cross-boundary implications does not mean that it's inappropriate for the SA DPD to deal with it, particularly if those are cross-boundary implications which are foreseen by or inherent in the district plan itself. So we'll pick that up in our notes and we'll deal with it that way. Thank you.
And what I will do is I'll give other parties a further week after the note comes in to make a response to that.
Entirely right, sir. Entirely right.
Right. Okay. Lucy Wilford.
Yes, just very briefly, after Mr. Brown's full response to our questions earlier, he didn't come back on our points regarding the scope of the plan, and it failing to address the requirements of the adopted local plan policies DP 25 and DP 30. I was just wondering whether the council had a response to those comments.
Okay, does the council wish to come back on those?
Sorry, is this the conversation that we've just had under the heading of 1.1, or is this going back to something that was said earlier?
You made comments on DP 25 and DP 30, You've been, it's been put to you that you were asked to respond to these comments and you haven't done so. So either you tell me you've already responded to them, or you tell me if you haven't, whether you want to.
Well, sir, I've picked up on the points that have been made orally. I mean, if I've missed something, I'm sorry. But
let's just go back then.
I'm not clear what the point is about DP25 and DP30 that's being made.
Yeah, let's just get back to this. Lucy, can you just elaborate slightly on what you want from the council?
It just goes back to my verbal comments about 10-15 minutes ago regarding the scope of the plan and its failure to engage with the requirements of policy DP25 and DP30 as set out in the adopted local plan. There is an acknowledged need for specialist accommodation. Those policies in the adopted local plan require this plan to address that need where that need is identified, and the scope of the plan fails to do that.
I wouldn't be too alarmed at this stage if you wanted to postpone this until we actually have the debate in matter 3.
Well, so that's exactly why I haven't come back and repeated what I said in the first session this morning, because in essence that I know Ms. Wilford doesn't like the answer, but that is the council's answer, and it will be the council's answer when we come back tomorrow. If you think it's the wrong answer, I'm sure in due course you will tell us. But so I've been through 1, when was the need identified? 2, does this plan turn its back on it? Mr. Tunnell gave you the answers to that this morning. We've been through, we've looked at DP25, we've looked at DP30. While they leave the door open to an allocation in the site allocations DPD, they do not require it. And in that context, they stand in stark contrast to policy DP4 on housing allocations, which is very clear that housing allocations are a requirement rather than an option. And in that sense, what the district plan says is entirely consistent with the PPG. Yes, we do somewhere along the way need to work out how we're going to address the needs of specialist groups, but that doesn't have to be an allocations policy. There is a discretion whether or not it should be an allocations policy. We've explained to you already the reasons why there isn't, beyond the reference to one at Imberhorn, why there isn't anything more in the site allocations DPD. That was the answer then, it's the answer now, it will be the answer again tomorrow.
Right, we'll move forward in that case. And Katie Lamb, what would you like to tell me?
Many thanks. I just wish to come back on Mr. Barnby's representations, because he does make a point that has been made by himself and Infrastructure First in many of their representations that I think has been there's a misunderstanding about what the site allocations DPD is seeking to do, and indeed that's transpired in many of the third-party objections to the plan. The district plan does accommodate a need to deliver housing for Crawley's unmet housing need as part of the Northern Housing Market Area. That doesn't mean to say that this site allocations DPD is solely to deliver Crawley's unmet housing need. Indeed, that's wrapped up in the development plan as a whole, comprising the district plan and the site allocations DPD. And arguably, other sites that have either already come forward or are allocated in the district plan would be more appropriate to meet that number of housing need for Crawley. For example, Peace Cottage. It does not mean to say that the site allocations DPD is doing that. Also, there was a suggestion that all neighbourhood plans have sought to deliver the housing needs set out in the district plan. That is not the case. Of course, the neighbourhood plans that came forward and were made before the district plan did not have to be in compliance with that document. So, for example, the East Grinstead neighbourhood plan did not deliver housing as required by the district plan. And that is what the site allocations DPD is seeking to do now, as no allocations in East Grinstead were made in the district plan. And also possibly helpful to the conversation we just had on policies SA34 to SA38. Just because, as Mr. Brown said, that they have strategic implications does not mean that they are strategic policies. And also, there is some argument to say that certainly the SA34 to 37 are allocation policies in their own right. For example, safeguarding of land for strategic highways improvements. Well, that's an identification of areas of land which should be safeguarded, or in other words, allocated to ensure that highways improvements that are necessary in the future can come forward. So I don't think they're outside the remit of this site allocations plan. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Are there any more comments on the Court of Appeal judgment that we've been talking about in its application, or can I move on to Little Romans 3, which is about policy SA Gen, and asking, does this adequately set out the general principles for the site allocations that are made in this plan? Again, I have to accept, Mr. Brown, there's probably an element of overlap here as well. But the council basically state why the allocations are needed. And they go through a whole series of areas or aspects that the council wish to address. So, for example, the flood risk, drainage, access, utilities. But the council's summary is that they are confident that the SA Gen policy captures the necessary requirements adequately. Then moving on to Grace Machin for Burgess Hill, Town Council and Suffolk, that the setting of the South Downs National Park should be assessed during the consideration of the DPD rather than during the course of the planning application. That Nexus question whether the allocations within the AONB can comply with this policy. Turley feel the policy could be simplified. Denton Homes state that policy SA Gen includes numerous requirements that sites comply with other policies such as AONB or heritage, but many of the allocated sites are within or adjacent to AONB heritage sites, and this will lead to policy conflict at the planning determination stage. Is anything the council want to add to what I've summarised?
Not at this stage, no, sir. I'm happy to come back when people have commented, but
right. Well, let's see if we've got any comments then. Anybody want to comment on this? Michael Brown from CPRE. Welcome back, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon to you and to everybody. I represent the Sussex branch of what I know as the Campaign to Protect Rural England, which is now more snappily known just as CPRE, if rather less helpfully. We make the case that SA Gen needs amendment to be justified and to comply with national policy, to make it clear that it is only suitable to allocate small-scale development within the High Weald. And we have in our written submission made a suggestion for a specific minor change to the wording of SA Gen to accompany that. We base the argument, first of all, on NPPF para 172, which says that in terms that any development within the High Weald or within an ANOB should be limited in scope and extent. We then base the argument further on findings of the inspector of the district plan itself, Mr. Bohr. And in our submission, we quote from his final report, in which he says that there shouldn't be any need for any large-scale development within the High Weald in order for the council to meet its housing needs within the plan, and that any development within the High Weald should be modest in extent. We refer you to a document sponsored by CPRE, a report issued in 2 stages, one in 2017 and one earlier this year, which looks at the extent of development that has taken place within areas of outstanding natural beauty across England, and flags the extent to which the High Weald has been very particularly exposed in practice development, and where the responsibility of the local planning authorities that govern the High Weald are particularly vulnerable to, well, the word isn't misuse, but overdevelopment. I have given you some in the submission, the details provided to me from an FOI request by the council itself, which shows that if you add together the amount of development that it has already given consent for within the High Weald, along with the 188 houses that would be allocated within the High Weald if this daughter document were adopted in its current form. And the total is over 1,500 houses already approved for development within the Mid-Sussex section of the High Weald, which is only 11% of the total area of the High Weald. So you can see that there is a very considerable vulnerability for the High Weald from overdevelopment. There isn't a necessity for large-scale allocation, not only because the Mr. Bohr concluded that in his own report on the original district plan, but it's borne out by the fact that the council is meeting its housing delivery, its housing target. It's got a more than 5-year housing plan. It's got the plan here. It's got a plan which provides for an oversupply of housing on the basis of a potential that some houses won't actually be delivered on the sites. We make no challenge to the need for an oversupply, but we do say that from a strategic point of view, no development needs to take place within the High Weald in excess of the local needs of the villages that are identified in their own neighbourhood plans. And that can be done using sustainable sites. There are plenty on offer from other representatives here of sites outside the High Weald, which are sustainable in themselves. So what we say to you, sir, is that there needs to be an amendment to SA Gen to make it clear that any development within the High Weald should be small scale only.
Thank you for that. Obviously, we're going to be talking about this a lot more in relation to SA 25 and maybe elsewhere. But thank you for that. Right, we've looked. Chris. Chris.
I was going to say you have another hand, sir. I mean, I'm very happy to respond to Mr. Brown now, unless Mr. Huff's point is also about AONB. If it is, then we'll collect all the AONB points.
We'll collect them all together, I think. Yeah, so thank you for that. So, Mr. Huff, is it about the AONB?
No, it's not, sir.
Right. I'm gonna have it anyway, and then I'll take Helena Griffiths, and then I'll come back to the council. So, Mr. Huff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir. Christopher Huff, Sigma Planning on behalf of Ryden Homes Limited. It was just a simple point on this policy that it really is nothing more than a list of relevant policies and considerations which are covered by other policies in the parent plan. And I just questioned whether we needed it. What is its purpose? And with the objective of trying to simplify the plan, do we need it? That's my simple question.
Right. Well, they don't get much more simple than that, so thank you. And we'll get the council, we'll ask the council to respond in a minute. But I'll just come to Helena Griffiths first. Helena Griffiths, welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you, sir. I'd just like to support actually the comments that have been made by the CPRE about the overdevelopment of the AONB, and also support that small scale development really only should be considered in these areas. I also support the Solfag comment saying that, yeah, the setting of sites sort of within these areas of outstanding natural beauty and areas of protection such as the national park should actually be determined really at the DPD level rather than at an application level. And I speak from first-hand experience, again bringing sites into the mix, but that's because that's what my experience is. In Horsted Canes, we've had an application go in for an allocated site, and it's details from within that application that actually show that the site itself is being excessively overdeveloped. And as a result, there's no sort of transition from the village itself into the AONB. So yeah, this site is actually described by Mid Sussex in the planning application as a large-scale development. So yeah, I think that's sort of borne out in the arguments, is that that site really shouldn't be being brought forward at that density of housing whatsoever in an AONB. So I'd just like to express my support for the comments that have been made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, there are no more hands appearing. Helena Griffiths has just spoken, so there's no more new hands. So, Mr. Brown, do we need this policy anyway? Is it just saying the obvious?
So, taking that question first, I mean, I understand entirely what Mr. Huff says, and of course, it's a truism that one has to read a plan as a whole. In this case, the development plan will be both the district plan and the site allocations DPD. And as one can see from looking at SA Gen, in many respects, what it is doing is referring back to relevant policies of the development plan that an experienced planner would know you probably had to look at in any event. So I understand why Mr. Huff asked the question that he asks. The reason why SA Gen is there is because, although that may be apparent to an experienced planner, from the local authority's point of view, it was thought helpful to have something which made clear the linkage between the SADPD and the district plan. In other words, that nobody should just pick up the site allocations document and take it away and assume that it told them everything they needed to know. And so as a general introduction, it was thought to be helpful just to signpost the key parts of the overarching, the parent document that one would need to look at when bringing forward a detailed application for any of the allocations. Now, so you may say to us, that doesn't need to be a policy. If that's the view that you take, we will take that on the chin. But then we would probably come back to you and say, in those circumstances, even if you tell us to take it out of the policy, can we have it at least in a reasoned justification or explanatory memorandum at the beginning? Just so there is that signpost for anybody who may not be completely familiar with the development plan process, to make them realise that they need to be looking at more than one document. So that's what I would say in relation to Mr. Huff's point. So if I pick up on CPRE's point, as I understand it, and I'm sure Mr. Brown will correct me if I've got it wrong, what he's asking for is that in relation to SA Gen, and in particular under the heading landscape considerations, the point dealing with the high-wheeled AONB, that you add in words or text which pick up that part of the NPPF which talks about major development in an AONB being exceptional. And so the short answer to that is that in the council's view, that wording is not necessary. And the reason why it is not necessary is because what SA Gen is directed at, and the clue is in the heading of the document, it is general principles for site allocations. These are not general development plan principles that might apply to any random site, any non-allocated site that somebody may want to come up with. If somebody comes up with a site which is not allocated, then that will be dealt with in accordance with policy DP 16 of the district plan. And so the wording of that was settled some time ago. I note parenthetically it doesn't include the point that Mr. Brown would like included, but that is the plan which deals with that. As far as the allocations are concerned, so you will know that from the council's perspective, it is our case that none of the allocations in the AONB is in fact major development. And if that's right, then we don't need to add in a provision in SAGen to say you can't have major development in the AONB if that policy is only dealing with allocations. Now, sir, I know from the representations that we've seen that at least in relation to Ardingly, that the argument, the council's position that is not major development is contentious. And that is quite rightly and properly a matter that you'll come back to and look at on another day when we get to look at sites in the AONB. But sir, from the council's perspective, I mean, we've never suggested that allocations should be for major development. The reason why the Ardingly allocation is there is because in our view, it is not. And it's on that basis that it's simply not necessary to add in those words to SAGen.
Thank you. I asked the questions that we've probably already answered or are going to answer in Little Roman 4, i.e. the policies SA 34 to 38. And a number of you have commented back on these. I'm very happy to take any more comments on this, although people may feel we've come to a point where we need to wait for this note from the council and people have time to reply to the note. If there are any extra comments, I don't want to curtail discussion. So that's my question. Policies SA 34 to 38 are termed development policies in the plan. Can they be considered to be strategic in nature? If so, does that in any way set a precedent or even a requirement for the plan to deal with other strategic issues such as housing provision? Now, I have a lot of answers from people anyway on that. Tim North would like to respond to this. You're welcome to now.
Thank you, sir.
Do continue, Mr. North.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you, yes.
Now he's just muted himself again.
Yeah, you're back on the little red man again. You need to unmute yourself. That's it.
Right, here we are. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you. Can't see you, but I can hear you.
Right. You can see me now.
I can see you.
All's clear. Technology is good. This may not be a point that's relevant at this particular point, at this particular stage, shall I say. So please interrupt me if this is inappropriate.
In answer to my question, that's fine.
I'm really concerned. My concern is with SA 34, and it may have more to do with the issues raised in matter 2 relating to the SA. But I'm looking at that policy purely from the point of view of someone on a Clapham omnibus who perhaps has no idea of what's gone on before, but reads that policy, SA 34, in conjunction with that part of policy DP1 of the district plan. In the district plan, this section that deals with the SA 34 point says that protecting allocated and existing employment land and premises, including tourism, unless it can be demonstrated that there is no reasonable prospect of its use or continued use for employment, or it can be demonstrated that the loss of employment provision is outweighed by the benefits or relative need for the proposed alternative use. That is a more flexible interpretation, as I read it, of what is now policy 34, which says that proposals on existing employment sites that would involve the loss of employment land or premises will only be supported where it can be clearly demonstrated by the applicant that the site premises is no longer needed and or viable for employment use. My concern is raised with the fact that the district plan policy, through its provisions, relates to provision being outweighed by benefits. That seems to me to be a interpretation whereby if benefits can be shown wherever they are, that one should therefore consider these existing employment sites in terms of alternative uses. That, I know, brings me on to the question of how you interpret that in terms of the essay, and how there has or has not been, as I see it, there's not been an assessment of these existing employment sites, particularly because I see that going to the heart of very many of the policies in both the district plan and the site allocations DPD. I see that there are prospects of interpretation governing what is said in the Mid-Sussex Employment Development Strategy. I see situations where one should take more credence of previously developed land than greenfield sites. And above all, when you're talking in terms of benefits, I can see benefits in terms of both landscape and biodiversity, particularly in areas of high wheeled AONB. These matters to me are quite important in the interpretation of development plan policies, should these two aspects, the DP1 and the SA34, remain as they are. And I think there could be real problems of how one interprets that. I realise, obviously, that SA34, as I've heard on many occasions now, is a daughter document to the district plan. But it seems to me that when one looks at these policies, one's got to be very careful as to whether you're opening up a Pandora's box by not actually assessing existing employment sites in terms of alternative uses. This may not be the appropriate stage to raise that. I fully accept that. It may be an appropriate stage to raise that in terms of sustainability appraisal, because it does go to the heart of these policies. Thank you, sir.
Okay, there will be an opportunity later in the proceedings to talk about the very things you're saying, but that's good just to get that raised. Mr. Huff again.
Thank you, sir. It was just to say that I don't think these policies can be considered as a group. They have to be considered individually. And in producing the note, I just wanted to ask the council, could they specifically refer each policy to an allocation in the plan or a group of allocations, so that they're justified by this plan rather than the parent plan and a general application? Because I take the point, I think it was Katie Lamb made it, that SA37 is an allocation, in effect, a safeguarding allocation, and that's appropriate for this type of plan. But SA38 is a generic air quality management plan that will apply, policy, sorry, that will apply to the whole of the plan, therefore really is a strategic policy that should come through the review. So it's just asking that that is a tailored response to individual policies, and linking each individual policy to a policy of the allocations document.
My recollection is that in fact the council, Paul Brown, has in fact indicated that's the approach he wants to take anyway. So I don't think. I think
I said you'd get a different answer to each policy. So
yeah,
but that was very much that point I had in mind. So
I endorse that then very much. Thank you, sir.
Fine. Tondra Todd.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just picking up on SA37, fully appreciate the need to hear the council's response on that. Just wanted to flag up the plan that goes with SA37, and you'll be able to clearly see. So the derivative for SA37, I suppose, from the high level plan comes from the infrastructure policy. And that's DP7, General Principles for Strategic Development at Burgess Hill. That's the policy that mentions the delivery of the multifunctional route between Burgess Hill and Haywards Heath, but that's very specific to Burgess Hill strategic allocations. And you have a look at the plan that goes with SA 37, and you'll see east of the railway a number of safeguarded routes and a dotted line which goes through Lewes District. So this is clearly, particularly to the east of the railway, this is clearly a cross-boundary policy and project. And in fact, the council did respond to that from our Reg 19 rep and have formalised a statement of common ground with Lewes District, sort of covering this point and the need to work together. So just wanted to highlight that, and obviously we'll wait with interest for the council's response. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm off this thing. I'm not on mute.
Right. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak on Monetary Roman numeral 4? Or is there anything the council wants to come back on?
Also, that he still has his microphone on.
Right. We're all on a learning curve on this.
That's all right. I've muted him. It's okay.
Okay. In that case, the Roman numeral 5 deals with neighbourhood plans. Does the plan keep within its remit in relation to the made and emerging neighbourhood plans within the plan area? The council's position is they've been supportive of the preparation of neighbourhood plans in Mid Sussex, almost complete coverage, more in matter 3.3. Grace Machin, that the plan doesn't accord with the principles of the made Burgess Hill neighbourhood plan. And again, we'll get into that in the next couple of days. And the Pegasus Group for Persimmon Homes and Thacombe Homes, that the Burgess Hill neighbourhood plan was made in 2016 and related to the built-up area of the town and referred to consents and allocations at the time, and therefore the plan is not in conflict. So we've got both points of view there. I'm happy to take any comments now because it is a question I've put in, but clearly we'll be coming back to this under 3.3 at least, if not elsewhere. Do I have any takers? Yes, Helena Griffiths.
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to point people towards my statement that I've made, which is on the council website. Horsted Keynes is in a little bit of an interesting situation at the minute. Up until about 8 weeks ago, the parish council were in support of the district plan. But since the application has come in on site SA 29, they've realised the implication of supporting the district plan. And so they have actually officially withdrawn support for the district plan. I note in Mid Sussex's comments that they've made in their document MSDC 002A, they actually state that in Horsted Keynes, the Regulation 16 consultation was published and further work has been paused by the parish council. That is actually incorrect. The parish council have not paused work at all. You can go onto their website to actually see that they have withdrawn support for the DPD. They have formed a new steering group and they have already started in assessing sites to actually allocate sites within Horsted Keynes within the neighbourhood plan itself. So I'd like to reiterate that, yeah, the work isn't paused by the parish council. The parish council are actually moving forward and they're moving it forward with speed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris Huff. Mr. Huff, would you like to speak?
Thank you. So yeah, it takes me some time to get the mouse across to the video and then to the
tell me about it.
So apologies for the delay. It's one of these modern improvements, isn't it? 2 points. The first is that, as you may know, and I'm sure most of the participants know, I represent Ryden Homes, who are the promoters of site SA 29. We've had various references to that and Horsted Keynes. I'm not rising to any contradictions at this stage, because it will be one of the sites that we're discussing in detail, I think, on the 10th of June. So just to make my position on that clear as to why I'm not seeking to clarify points at this stage. The second point is, so this plan has a three-stage process in terms of the provision of housing. The first stage was the parent plan, which provided some allocations, but held back for future allocation in two respects. And the first was through neighbourhood plans. And then my understanding was that this plan was to mop up any shortfalls that there were thereafter. I think really the point I only want to make at this stage is that that is the context for this plan, that this is the last of the three stages by which the plan can deliver the housing that it has to deliver. And therefore, we do need to be sure this time that we have a full provision and that there is an adequate buffer. And that really is the context for our discussion tomorrow. Thank you.
Right. If there's no more comments from any party, we'll move on to duty to cooperate. Bearing in mind, we've still got the essay to do today. And my question there in Romans 1 is the DTC a duty to cooperate, which covers some strategic matters? Is it applicable to this plan as a Part 2 plan? And if so, has the council adequately discharged the DTC in preparing the plan? The council state strategic matters set out in the strategic in the statement of common ground prepared to support the district plan, and that some strategic matters are outside the scope of this plan, and they mention things like meeting needs outside the district. However, the council has engaged with adjacent local planning authorities to ensure ongoing dialogue and to demonstrate the district plan strategy being delivered through the SADPD. Council also recommend or recognise that some cross-boundary matters have arisen during this preparation of this plan. They mention SA19 and SA20 close to the Tandridge boundary, which we've mentioned. SA12 and 13 close to the Lewis boundary. And there's been engagement, for example, with statutory service providers as well. So that's the council's, a very brief summary of the council's response. Turley states that it appears as though the council has taken the view that the district plan deals with the matter of unmet housing need, and it has not considered whether the circumstances or any updated evidence indicate this requires a revised approach. Well, we've talked about the previous decision, the Tandridge decision already, so we don't need to go back over that. The Parker Dan contribution is that the DTC is applicable to the plan, dealing with strategic matters, including strategic sites with cross-boundary impacts. For example, traffic impacts on the highway network in Lewis, for example, and probably in Tandridge as well. And SA37 that we just talked about. And then the representative from Infrastructure First is that the council has not adequately demonstrated in evidence that it has effectively cooperated to plan for issues with evident cross-boundary impacts when it submitted the plan for examination. So quite a big contention there. Is there anything the council would like to come in on those comments or elaborate their position a bit more?
So not at this stage, no. I mean, we've been very clear about the ambit of the duty to cooperate. There is some scope for it in the context of a daughter document, but that doesn't extend to reopening wider issues of need. We've been very clear that to the extent that it arises within the context of a daughter document, we've complied. So you will know that as far as all the surrounding local authorities are concerned, we have statements of common ground with them. They also are satisfied. That doesn't necessarily stop other people saying that we've all got it wrong, but it's a pretty good starting point.
Thank you for that. Does anybody else want to comment? Graham Keane.
So thank you. Could I just take the opportunity, firstly, to agree with the council on ambit, but mainly, so just to address you very briefly on the second part of your question about adequate discharge of the duty to cooperate in preparing the plan. It's our case that Mid Sussex's written response that you have before you on this question shows the comprehensive extent of the cooperation that's been undertaken with the prescribed bodies, and that there has been clear, active and ongoing engagement. And that is, from our perspective, very well demonstrated by the evolving and then now updated statement of common ground that I hope you have from not just Mid Sussex District Council, but West Sussex County Council's Highways Authority, Highways England, and my clients, or Vale Williams on behalf of my clients, in relation to the updated statement of common ground on highways matters in relation to the STP. That was originally, so you recall, I think a December 2020 document. It was updated in May of this year. And that is a statement of common ground with those parties. It itself shows very considerable and constructive ongoing cooperation. So while I'm on today, and having mentioned that statement of common ground, can I just flag one small sort of minor matter, but it's just as a formality. The document, that latest statement of common ground, is referenced SA 9.17. Unless you have it right to hand, sir, I don't suggest you need to turn it up, but can I just take one very brief point on it? It's clear from the cover sheet the parties who are involved and have signed the statement of common ground are, and in particular they include Vale Williams and Connect on behalf of my clients, as well as Mid Sussex, West Sussex and Highways England. But when you turn, just for your notes, to 1.1.2 of the statement itself, it tells you that it's the statement of common ground between West Sussex, Mid Sussex District Council and Highways England, and my clients, or Vale Williams on behalf of my clients and Connect, seem to have dropped off that paragraph. So I hope it's perfectly clear from the cover sheet and the content that this is indeed a statement of common ground with Vale Williams on behalf of my clients. But if, as a matter of formality, that's something that you would like adjusted in a revised statement of common ground, no doubt that can be put in train. But I thought I'd flag it, having spotted it.
Well, you've given it to me in evidence now. I've noted it, and I think that's probably sufficient. So, but thank you for the offer. We'll cut down on paper where we can.
That sounds good to me. Thank you.
So, Tondra Tom.
Thank you, sir. A number of the points that we made at Regulation 19 on behalf of Fairfax and the Clearwaters Farm site have been picked up within duty to cooperate updates and submitted as part of the plan. What wasn't picked up, and to be really clear, the representation wasn't asking Mid Sussex to revisit unmet housing need, merely to have regard in terms of the Localism Act to 2B of section 33A, which talks about having regard to activities of a person within subsection 9, so far as they're relevant to the activities. And the preparation of development plan documents is within that. And then point D under 3, activities that can be reasonably considered to prepare the way for activities within any of those paragraphs above, i.e. preparation of development plans, and activities that support activities within any of the paragraphs. So we highlighted in Reg 19 the impending situation in Lewis in relation to their land supply and the age of their plan and the needs to update the plan. And we suggested a reserve site within the Mid Sussex plan, which would help to add flexibility to Mid Sussex's own land supply and commitments on the edge of Haywards Heath, but also that could help to deliver SA37, as that one of the proposed routes runs straight through this site. The purpose of the reserve site allocation would then enable Lewis, within their forthcoming plan, to make that site allocation. And we proposed a policy suggesting that the allocation only come forward contingent upon Lewis allocating it within their plan. So there was no need for this to fall outside of the scope stated within the plan to look at unmet needs within Lewis, merely to support the activities of a neighbouring authority. And being that SA37 and its strategic implications had already engaged Lewis on this matter, it's disappointing that no response was made to the opportunity that was presented through our Reg 19 rep for Clearwater's Farm. Thank you.
Thank you. Juan Lopez.
So good afternoon. Just to confirm that the action group is no longer pursuing the duty to cooperate complaint.
Thank you. Before we leave this topic, I wonder whether the council do want to respond on this suggested reserve site on the boundary with Lewis.
I think Mr. Marsh has something to say on that topic. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not a site that has been discussed with Lewis. I'm looking at their most recent SHLAR document. I can't see that it's in there either. The other half that Tom refers to. If it is, and if we wanted to look at any further cross-boundary work, then that's an issue for the district plan review, alongside a review of all the unmet needs of neighbouring authorities, as we rightly have to do at that stage, but not as a top-up to our current district plan.
So you'll have noted the way in which Ms. Tom put it in the submissions to you a moment ago, that it could be in as a contingent allocation dependent upon Lewis allocating the site in their area. I have to say, so that would be an extraordinary basis to allocate any site in a plan, not least of all because unless there was some evidence that Lewis was going to do that, it would call into question issues of the deliverability of the site, which of course is one of the cornerstones of soundness. And I would not want to be sitting in my seat today trying to explain to you that the site was deliverable in a world where it was contingent on those circumstances.
Right, Tom's got her hand raised again.
Yeah, thank you. Just to confirm, it was submitted to the Lewis ahead of the call for sites at the same time and with the rep that was submitted to Ms Sussex, and it was subsequently reaffirmed in the Lewis call for sites. So not sure why that's not showing, but we can follow up on that. Thank you.
Right, thank you, everybody. I'm going to move on now to matter 2. So we're going to talk about sustainability appraisal and a habitats regulation assessment. And my first question is the plan supported by the SA and HRA? Before we do any of that, I think we'll have a short break and we'll make it 15 minutes. We'll come back at 10 to 4. Thank you. Charlotte, I'm ready to go when everybody else is.
Yep, I think everybody's
ready.
Everybody's here.
Okay, right. So welcome back, and we come on to matter 2. So we're dealing with the sustainability appraisal habitats regulation assessment. First question is the plan supported by these documents, the SA and the HRA? The council's comments state that these procedures have been carried out in accordance with the relevant legislation and best practice. They refer me to their topic paper 3. They've looked at alternative approaches, but basically the SA focuses on all reasonable alternative options to meet the strategy and residual requirements set out within the district plan. And the SA concludes that the majority of the site options chosen for allocation impact positively on the social and economic objectives. Negative impacts are to be mitigated through site-specific policies, and in some cases there's an inevitable conflict between allocating land for housing and protecting the environment, and that the sites represent the most reasonable, sustainable alternatives. Does mention the adverse effects on the integrity of the Ashdown Forest, SBA and SAC in relation to air quality and recreation impacts, but they can now be ruled out, and that this means that the plan, the DPD, is justified and effective in relation to again, in relation to Ashdown Forest and the air quality. The council refer me to recent Dutch case law, which has highlighted that expected benefits must be certain. There's confidence that the scientific evidence used to predict an improving emissions trajectory and certainty in its realisation over the planned period has to be that confidence, and that highways improvements are likely to bring positive benefits with minor retardation. On the recreation side, again in relation to Ashdown Forest, the council is saying that the strategic approach to recreational impacts is supported by Natural England. There's also the SAMM contributions, and they say that's working well. I noticed that one or two of you don't think that. Maybe we'll get into debate on that. New SANG options are proposed, including allocations for a strategic SANG, as we heard an hour or so ago, as part of SA20. And that the NAE, Natural England, has confirmed that it concurs with the HRA conclusions. A few other comments have come in. Michael Fell, that the SA and HRA have failed to take account all the available evidence when determining the effects on biodiversity and environment, which in his view renders the site selection unsound. On the other hand, Judith Ashton Associates say yes, the plan is supported by the SA and HRA. Andrew Black Consulting for Vanderbilt Homes feel there's not enough assessment of reasonable alternatives, particularly trying to divert attention away from the AONB or designated heritage assets. Lawrence Foote, the SA appears to have been drawn up to support a predetermined plan objective rather than informing it in a transparent manner, so a criticism there. Richard Barnby Housing, that the proposed sites in the gap between East Grinstead, Fellbridge, Crawley Down pose a direct risk to the Ashdown Forest, since they are within 7 kilometres, within that 7 kilometres zone of influence. The council does not appear to be adopting the precautionary approach. So maybe that's a good question to ask the council then right at the start of this. Is the council adopting a precautionary approach in its sustainability appraisal work?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just to reiterate that we are, the sustainability appraisal, the process for sustainability appraisal is to understand and predict future impacts on the range of objectives. And in all of our work on the sustainability appraisal, that's our approach, that we take a consistent approach across all of the options that are put in front of us, and assess them on the basis of the information in front of us and the evidence in front of us and the baseline position, which is the starting point. That's our approach. I think we set it out quite clearly in our response to matter 2.1, that the sustainability appraisal accompanies the plan, considers all reasonable alternatives that are in relation to this plan and the scope of this plan, and therefore it has influenced the process.
There's been some criticism from a number of representatives that you've kind of, if I can try and paraphrase what they're saying, you're being a bit colourblind over the AONB, that you've not given it the protection it affords in the way that you've gone through your essay methodology. How would you answer that?
There's two things on that to note. First of all, in terms of the overall strategy and the principle of development in the AONB, we cover that off in our topic paper 3, our response MSDC 01 as well, which were related to the principle of developing the AONB, which was established by the district plan and by the inspector on the district plan and his conclusions in his report. So in terms of reasonable alternative of considering sites not in the AONB as a starting point, we're working on a strategy that's already been adopted and through its own essay. And secondly, in terms of the specific criteria, you'll see under the environmental criteria, we have particular reference to the AONB on criteria 9. And so it's just to set the stall out in terms of where we are with reasonable alternatives for the essay, the filtering method that we undertook, which took us from all of the sites in our Sheila all the way down to the reasonable alternatives. Obviously, one of the most important criteria with weight accorded to it, as we said earlier on, you could achieve a red on that criteria, was on the AONB itself. So sites which had a significant impact on the AONB, in the view of the High Weald AONB unit who assisted us with the conclusions on those, were filtered out as a reasonable alternative. They didn't get that far in the process.
Okay, thank you for that. Has anybody else got any comments on question 2.1? Dr. Ashley Barr.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, sir. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent, good start. We've got 3 points, and they probably straddle your 2.1 and 2.2, but if it's acceptable to you, we'll make them most efficiently together.
Sure.
And I'll deal with the first two, and I'll invite, with your permission, Mr. Grace, my planning consultant, to address you on the third point. The first point is that the SA fails, contrary to Regulation 12 of the regulations, to assess all reasonable alternatives having regard to the objectives and geographical scope of the plan. And we've identified those in our hearing statement, but just to give you two particular examples. First of all, on sites, we say that the 1 to 5 Queen's Walk, which is a site in East Grinstead, that was, we say, irrationally kicked out at a very early stage in the site sifting process. And you have the detail for that in SSP 3, which is the Council Site Selection third paper. And within the East Grinstead section, which is in Appendix A, where it goes through each individual settlement, it sets out the sites in the Sheila that it wasn't carrying forward, some of which have perfectly obvious reasons why they're not carried forward, because they're not available or they're not deliverable because the developer doesn't own them. But one, which is 961 1 to 5 Queen's Walk, 100 units, it says the reason this has been kicked out is because the site has policy support within the East Grinstead Neighbourhood Plan, support in the East Grinstead Neighbourhood Plan, which one might presuppose is a good reason for including it within a site selection process. And then if you turn within the neighbourhood plan, which is in the examination library at 011, policy SS2 of the East Grinstead neighbourhood plan does indeed allocate that site, and it allocates it for a mixed use and envisages something in the region of 100 units coming forward as part of that mixed use. And it said the reason for that is to enhance the town. So there is a category one, a site within a category 1 settlement that we're told the council is prioritising for its growth, which it has, we say, irrationally not carried through at all into the SA. And secondly, if I can just give you another example, there is an elephant in the room here in terms of reasonable alternative strategies which have not been explored, because what the council does on page 58 of its essay at paragraph 6.48 is to say, well, we looked at the 20 constant sites, and that delivers us a surplus of 144 units, but we want a larger buffer. We'll get on to whether that's a good thing or not in another matter. And what they've then done is to only assess category 1 sites, notwithstanding the fact there are sites in other categories that perform equally well to those moderately performing sites in category 1 they have assessed. And we say, well, that's a bizarre omission and an unlawful omission, considering that those moderately performing sites, we are told, are reasonable alternatives. And if you look at the table on page 56 of the essay, it shows us that there is a shortfall in category 2 and category 3. And one might have thought that at least as an assessment exercise, I mean, whether you ended up with this as a final option or not, but at least as part of the assessment exercise, you would have seen what the comparative impacts would have been by allocating some additional housing at category 2 and category 3 settlements. You've got plenty which are set out on page 57 and 58. And all it says as to why they haven't been assessed is, well, because we want to prioritise category 1. And we say, well, foreclosing that was an unlawful breach of the regulations because they are by definition reasonable alternatives and they haven't explored them. Second point, headline point, is we say, well, there is inconsistency in the way the council has treated the sites it has assessed. And the easiest way, if I can demonstrate this to you, sir, we have explained it in our hearing statement, but it is really one of those visual things. If you have the essay to hand, or you have it electronically to hand, and you can turn to page 59, if that's easily done, sir. I know you said you had some difficulty accessing your documents earlier.
I'm making a note of it anyway, and I'll come back to it later.
Okay, so I'll deal with it this way. So page 59 is where the council assesses the 3 options. Option A, 20 constant sites. Option B, 20 constant sites plus Folders Lane. Option C, 20 constant sites plus Haywards Heath Golf Course. And what it does there is it scores those 3 strategies against the sustainability objectives. And so if you look down, when you get to that table on page 59, objectives 2, 3, 4, and 14, which are the health, education, retail, and regeneration objectives, Haywards Heath Golf Club is scored less preferably to the Folders Lane sites. And you might say, well, that's a planning judgment and that's for the council. And they say overall on page 60, Haywards Heath Golf Course is distant from existing services and facilities. And you might say, well, fair enough, that was a judgment for them. But if you then turn within the essay to where the council assessed the sites on an individual basis, which is page 134 for Haywards Heath, miraculously and bizarrely, Haywards Heath Golf Club is scored top marks, so double plus, for health, education, retail, and regeneration. We are told that it is within 10 to 15 minutes walking distance of all the facilities, GP, nearest primary school, convenience store, and we're told overall it performs very positively against the social objectives. So completely inconsistent with what the council is then telling you when it's performing the overall assessment at page 59. To complete the picture of why that's through the looking glass, at the same time the council downgrades Haywards Heath Golf Club, it upgrades on its initial assessment the Burgess Hill sites. And you see that if you go to page 123 of the sustainability appraisal, you see what the council thought when it was looking at these sites on their own. They were all scored either moderate positively, or in the case of SA12, they were scored positively poorly. And we're told overall that they are in excess of 15 to 20 minutes walking distance from facilities. So in the space of the same document, the same sites have gone from what Haywards Heath Golf Course being preferable to the Burgess Hill sites, to then that being switched around without any explanation at all, just a bare change in the scoring exercise to fit what is, we say in our respectful submission, a predetermined strategy, which you see at page 59. And we say, well, that's a fairly egregious and fairly blunt exercise in gerrymandering the scoring to go from what the council truly thought when they were assessed on an individual basis to when the council thought, well, that doesn't quite add up for our overall strategy. So they've then bluntly downgraded one and upgraded the other. And for our third point, I'm just going to turn, with your permission, to Mr. Grace to deal with the irrationality in the individual scoring. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With regards to irrational scoring, there is little or no evidence to say why, first of all, a buffer of more than 144 units provided through the constant sites is required. However, we have a situation of marginal sites in Tier 1 settlements being dismissed, but those in Burgess Hill, SA 12 and 13, being identified as performing well, even though Burgess Hill has met its residual need. No mention of impacts of environmental objections, especially the National Park, the South Downs, or an adjacent listed building in relation to site SA 13. With just 3 options to consider, the comparative assessment in the SA, again, pages 59 to 61, appears overly simplistic and rather poor. It's just been mentioned with reference to Haywards Heath Golf Club. This was considered a highly sustainable option in site selection paper 3, but this is not reflected as such in the council's SA assessment, once again, 59 to 61. No reference appears to the extensive mitigation work already undertaken in respect of Haywards Heath site, its managed man-made landscape, compared to the ancient medieval field patterns of SA 12 and 13. And at the time of the assessment process, the Haywards Heath Golf Club had been robustly and thoroughly assessed, whereas SA 12 and 13 had not. The assumption that option C would lead to greater environmental impacts compared to option B appears unjustified and produces an unsound outcome for the proposed allocations in the DPD. And at the time of these hearings commencing, we don't believe the council has provided robust justification in respect of the removal of many sites in the DPD process. This has resulted in a lack of transparency, questions of process, and if it's been a legitimate and defensible process. And therefore, in conclusion, it's wholly unclear how the council has reached its conclusions regarding which sites should be taken forward for further consideration as part of the SA process and which should be removed. Thank you.
That's Andrew Black, please come in.
Thank you, sir. Just in relation to realistic or reasonable alternatives, and following on from the very good points just made on that, the planning practice guidance sets out matters for local authorities to consider when they're undertaking the sustainability appraisal in relation to reasonable alternatives. And it sets out that it effectively states this, that reasonable alternatives are the different realistic options considered by the plan maker in developing the policies in the plan. And it then says they need to be sufficiently distinct to highlight the different sustainability implications of each so that meaningful comparisons can be made. Now, in terms of those options that you've been taken to, you have 3 options. You have option A, which is 20 constant sites, which is 1,619 dwellings. You then have option B, which is 20 constant sites, plus Folders Lane, Burgess Hill, 3 sites, which is 1,962. You then have option C, which is 20 constant sites, plus Haywards Heath Golf Course, which is 2,249. And the conclusion within the essay at paragraph 6.52, and I'm paraphrasing here, is effectively option A, not enough. Option B, just about right. Option C, too many homes. But in all of those options, you have those 20 constant sites. Nowhere have the council effectively set out what the difference is in those different options. And nowhere have the council sought to look at what might happen if you guided development away from the AONB or away from designated heritage assets. And that's really our fundamental problem, sir, that going back, each of those options are not, we say, sufficiently distinct. They don't allow anyone to make a meaningful comparison. That's the guidance that's set out, and the council has failed to do that properly. We do concur with the comments just made by Dr. Bowes in terms of how the council has sought to assess individual sites. We'll take you to those in matter 3, but we would concur that there are some substantial errors in individual sites. So that's it from us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Juan Lopez.
So thank you. Can I cheerfully piggyback points 1 and 3 of Dr. Bowes in relation to the irrationality of early day kick-out, if I can put it that way, of reasonable alternatives, save for it being demonstrated through adequate reasons that they can be dealt with in that manner. The example that we give is Crabbett Park. And so back on our statement, the reference is from 1.5 onwards. It appears that the approach that the council's taken in terms of that, we say, plainly reasonable alternative is to kick it out so that it isn't assessed against any of the 17 sustainability criteria. But there are no reasons, still less adequate reasons given for that early day kick out. The reference within the council statement seems to be encased within paragraph 210 and only 210. It's a rather bold, punchy statement, but it simply says that each of the reasonable alternative sites being appraised against the objectives and indicators within the DPD SA in accordance with the methodology set out in the scoping report and subsequent RA 1819 essays. Well, that's all you have in terms of a wrap-up conclusion with regard to Crabbett Park on the statement itself. So what the action group did is to interrogate the basis further still, and you'll see within their matter statement. So if you have it to hand or electronically, it took a couple of efforts to uncover the rationale. So the council maintain, I think this is their maintained position as to why they excluded Crabbett Park. And you'll see it really was at the end trail of these emails that they fessed up, if you like, in terms of the basis for which they excluded it. So it's on the final page of our matter statement 2.2, and you'll see it was on the basis of, so the table tells us, connectivity. But if you read further up, it's the final page 8 of that representation.
Just getting it now.
You have it, sir.
I'm just getting it. Page 8.
Yes, please. Yeah. The table tells you connectivity, if you have that.
Right, page 8 of 8. I've got down question 2.2, realistic alternatives at the top.
You should have a couple of emails there. The first email on the page 8 is from Planning Policy, dated 9th of
That's
September.
right. Yeah, go that.
Yeah, you have that. Yeah. So that was the conversation being had between the parties in terms of, well, what's the rationale for this early kick out of Crabbit. And then what the council were returning with, well, it's either or, as applies across the board, either or these 2 bullet points. And so it's only by reason of the table being provided. You'll see exclude connectivity, which is the 4th, it's the 5th column across. Exclude connectivity, yes. And you'll see 18, it should be in highlight, Crabbit Park.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and then you understand what connectivity means in that sense. When you look back to the email above, first bullet point,
yeah,
which was on the measurement that the council supposedly undertook in relation to the location of Crabbit Park to the nearest built-up boundary.
150 metres.
Yeah, that's it. Only we've undertaken our own measurement of that, and it comes far shorter than that at circa 80 metres. We think that measurement's fairly robust. And so we don't have any evidence base to demonstrate that the measurement actually undertaken by the council bears out the conclusion that you see in the table. So if anything, there's a factual error underlying the basis upon which the council, too early day, we say, kicked out our reasonable alternative. But the council confirmed it was squarely, exclusively on the basis of connectivity with existing settlements. So if factually the council are wrong about that, and we firmly say that they are, it's actually about half the distance they measured it to be, then the whole premise, the whole basis upon which they have kicked out our reasonable alternative is flawed. So the rationale with it falls away, and it ought to have gone on through the assessment process. And I'm glad that the council underscored and characterised it that way. That's quite correct. It's an ongoing process. It ought to have been included moving forwards. But so what you know is that the only basis at any stage that the council have kicked out early day, that reasonable alternative, we say to be factually flawed on the measurement basis alone. It's interesting to know that the rationale that the council advocated only came through after our questions were pitched. And you'll see it was about 4 or 5 emails through. We had to keep asking politely to understand on what basis they'd remove Crabbit Park. And so underscoring all of that, then factual error underlying what would be on its face an irrational premature kick out of a plainly reasonable alternative. And so supplementary to that, it is a separate heading, and equally a legal error is inadequate reasoning being given for that early day kick out of that reasonable alternative. So that's the failing that we say is given rise to in conjunction with the SA. What I have done is link up, sir, your two matter to 2.1 and 2.2 questions in that respect. So that deals with the whether or not the SA can support the plan. As regards that reasonable alternative, we say no, it can't, because it fails on the on inadequacy, and for the reasons I've given. And so turning to 2.2, it would have been, had a fuller and proper assessment been carried out, a reasonable alternative to have been assessed at a later stage within the process. So that's the SA. Might I address you very quickly and discreetly in terms of the HRA?
Yeah, sure.
Since I've got the floor, if you like, and I don't want to trespass upon matter 3 insofar as it cuts across SA 19 and SA 20. You'll appreciate that that's a focal interest of my client. Nor do I want to cut across matter statement 4.5 dealing with the SANG and the SAM. But can I just highlight just a very quick route map, hopefully not to rehearse what we've already got in our matter 4.5, but so you might cross-refer back to that matter statement to help you with our route map. But ultimately, in terms of that question as to the council's justification for concluding no adverse impact as an overall assessment, as I read it, we say it's flawed, both in respect of the impacts that will arise through the allocations for SA 19 and SA 20. There is acknowledgement by the council, importantly, in terms of likely significant effects on the integrity of the Ashdown Forest SAC SPA. And that asks of all of us then to consider what significance in mitigation terms is being provided today through the existing SANG capacity, its limitations, its constraints, its workability, if you like, moving forwards, and whether or not there is additional provision to mitigate the effect of both of those allocations, SA19 and SA20. And I imagine the council may be, and it may be their only justification to point on the evidence base to the consultation response from Natural England. But so you'll appreciate from your experience that that can only take you so far if, as is not infrequently the case, that Natural England and its approach is not itself fully reasoned. I don't need to criticise the consultation response from Natural England to know that they don't advance any clear or cogent reasoning in support of any end conclusion, if this is being maintained, that the overall likely significant effects are not going to be objectionable. If that's the end conclusion that the council reach, it appears that they do, and we think at this stage, until we receive or read more, that they are pointing perhaps to monitoring evidence or the potential for monitoring evidence to come forwards. So our understanding is that the council either haven't undertaken adequate or any monitoring, or haven't produced any evidence base in support of any monitoring undertaken. So that's our understanding at the present time. If I'm wrong about that, as a matter of fact, I'll be corrected. It would help to be corrected today, and then we can revisit things ahead of matters 3 and matters 4. But that's, if you like, to open the batting in terms of your question on HRA. But as you've observed with others, there's quite a bit of overlay between that and
there is.
3 and 4.
Let's move. Thank you for that. I'll just move on to the other people who want to speak, and then we'll get the council to respond to all these points. So thank you for that, Mr. Lopez. David Murray Cox next, please.
Thank you, sir. There's probably 2 or 3 points that we have with the SA. Other participants have already mentioned the issue of the alternatives. Say in our statement that that's a very limited range of alternatives, and actually the consequence of the arbitrary and inconsistent approach to discounting sites at the early stage of the process, for example, site selection paper 1, had that not been the case, then there may well have been a broader range available at the SA stage. Our next point is that of scoring, and the real point that we struggle with is how the authors of the essay have come up with scoring that they have, because the evidence is either of some age or on particular topics. It doesn't seem to be there at all. And the key example that we refer to is heritage. And if you were to go back to page 59, as I think Mr. Black took you to say later on, you'll see that the 3 options against heritage all get the same score, which I think is the 0 or uncertain. And there's a comment in the right-hand column that says no negative or adverse effects are expected. But again, when you go to the Rogers Farm site, that one does get a negative score. So we can't tally the site assessment in the essay for each individual site with the overall conclusions on the 3 options. The last point really that we have on the essay is what the viability assessment says, because my reading of paragraph 513 of that document is that there's at least 3 sites which the text says are shown not to be viable. Well, if they're not viable, then in our submission, they're not realistic alternatives. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, John Litton, please.
get there in the end with my unmuting. Thank you, sir. Really, my points have been largely made for me by Juan Lopez and Dr. Ashley Bowes. But just to put a little bit more fat on the bone, I cast my surveyor's eye over this question of proximity, otherwise known as connectivity, and I certainly didn't come to figures in excess of 150 metres referred to in connection with Crabbit Park, otherwise known as land east of Crawley. So I too have doubts as to whether that was correct, but I would also question whether that as a bald basis of calculation was really appropriate for dealing with development in this particular locality. When it came to the scoring, I too had some significant concerns about that. For instance, on the road congestion one, it seemed that East Grinstead scored a plus with a question mark behind it, whereas east of Crawley clearly it scored a minus. Now, they share common ground in talking about what you might call the end of the A264 nearest to and just immediately east of junction 10 of the M23. They both share that particular congestion point. But one of the things that was put forward, and it's actually not mentioned at all in any of the comments, was the possibility of having a relief road from the Crabbit Park area down to junction 10A, and that does not appear anywhere. And that was suggested because one of the participant landowners owned all the land down to, or owned the balance of the land down to junction 10A. Was never appeared as a consideration. Another thing was matter for exclusion was lack of capacity at the what's known as now, I used to know it's the Gatwick sewage treatment works, but I understand it's now as the Crawley sewage treatment works, which is fair enough. But we were faced with the extraordinary situation where Thames Water, who control that particular facility, said we have a duty to provide, but we are not going to make any forward provision unless it's in the local plan. Mid Sussex District Council, for their part, saying you don't meet the criteria that we set unless there is capacity. Well, you know, damned if you do and damned if you don't is all I would say there. So we had all these sort of conundrums and facilities on site, lack of shops, education and employment. But it refers almost in parenthesis, but not quite, that on a size of this site, provision could be made. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that back in 2008, so several local plans ago, RPS, the planning consultants, submitted on behalf of the then developer that the landowners were talking to, namely Miller Strategic Land, a very, very extensive body of documentation. It was submitted in both hard copy and in CD, and I'm sure it must be lurking around in the council's situation in their paperwork somewhere. And I don't know, maybe it's that all these things have to be covered yet again at vast cost every time there's another local plan. Does nothing ever get sort of retained for the purposes of looking at these sites and analysing? So there's that. There was a criticism on a loss of employment space. But I couldn't work out where this employment space that was so important that was going to be lost. So it wasn't specified. And there was some travel and site make for an unsustainable location. And I paraphrase, but to be honest, if you were dealing with something which is focused on employment and the facilities and the cultural activities in adjacent Crawley, something that was immediately adjacent to Crawley's boundary would seem to me to make a lot of sense and is acknowledged as such, but nonetheless, later on, it is been dismissed. And I think this is, if I can take you back to my intervention this morning, sir, when I talked about a bias, well, whether cognitive or otherwise, I will leave it to you. But it did seem to me that there was an implicit bias running through all of this, because otherwise the basis of comparison on these various matrices that are contained in the essay could not possibly have been put in the manner they had. But I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Mr. John Litton, thank you for that. I'll bring in Tim North.
Yep. Hello.
Tim North.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Right. My question really relates to the issue of reasonable alternatives, and in specific terms, the lack of any assessment carried out of existing employment sites as part of the SA process. It seems to me that at a time when the employment land situation is in surplus, and has been certainly over the last 7 years since the North West Sussex economic strategy was produced by Litchfield, that hasn't changed, that it is incumbent to consider existing employment sites to assess, if only because of what is said in DP1, whether the existing employment site in itself is still suitable for its designated employment purpose.
Okay, we're going to come on to employment later in the week, or next week. So I think just leave the employment side for the time being. I'm conscious that, in fact, we're running fairly tight on time at the moment. Did you have any other points on alternatives?
Yes, so the only other point I had with respect to the alternative for employment sites being looked at is that the advice from the EU on carrying out SA requires the authority to look at land which is already designated for employment purposes. And that is echoed, if I might say so, sir, as you will know, in paragraph 120 of the framework, which talks about decisions needing to reflect changes in the demand for land. If we're going to assess employment sites, it is quite possible, and I'm not saying all by any means, that there are sites, my client is one of them, which have long established histories of employment, but where there has been little attempt made to look into the future apart from maintaining the status quo. The situation, it seems to me, is quite clear that these sites, if one is to adhere to the economic development strategy which the council are adopting, and if one is to look to finding the optimum sites, i.e. PDL land as opposed to greenfield sites for alternative uses, then an assessment of existing employment sites is important in that process.
Okay, I've got that point about the assessment needed. You made that before. I've got that point. Are there any other points?
No, that's my main point.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to Tondra Tom again.
Thank you, sir. A few short points on your question 2.2, evidence that the SA has influenced the plan, and then reasonable alternatives. Just quickly, in terms of influencing the plan, the SA does not seem to acknowledge the wider cross-boundary impacts from a number of the policies it assesses. It fails to identify the cross-boundary impacts on the highway network in Lewes, and particularly the B2122 through Ditchling from the site allocations, and then also policy SA 37 within the SA. There's no recognition of those cross-boundary links. So that's first point. Second point, is to do with the idea that the yield of a site is too large by comparison to the settlement's residual requirements, and whether that's appropriate for a Category 1 settlement. The site I represent, Clearwater's Farm, was assessed as suitable at stage 1, relatively unconstrained, assessed as suitable, progressed to stage 2. However, it then is kicked out as an early kick out, rather than being assessed as a reasonable alternative. This is slightly strange. It's within 150 metres of the boundary. Access can be provided in 2 places in the site. There is some woodland to the north, but there is a big gap between the blocks of ancient woodland. And in fact, this is the route where SA 37 from policy for the multifunctional network runs. So connectivity would be excellent through the site, and the site could help to deliver SA 37. So we would argue that is a reasonable alternative to assess, particularly, for example, against Haywards Heath Golf Course, which also has ancient woodland, is probably further from the settlement, and greenfield land. So it's not clear why this hasn't progressed through, and it's a failing of the SA that it's not been assessed as a reasonable alternative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Lucy Wilford.
I'll simply try and be brief. The SA identifies challenges of an ageing population, but this is not translated into any social sustainability objectives against which sites would be measured. It only considers completions for general market and affordable housing. The SA simply therefore doesn't consider the need for specialist accommodation to meet the challenges it itself identifies. This is contrary to the adopted local plan, its strategic objectives as set out on page 8, which looks for housing to provide the amount and type of housing that meets the needs of all sectors of the community. The simple point being is, how has the council come to an assessment, made a sound assessment, of the need to allocate sites for specialist accommodation when the consideration is absent from its evidence base?
Okay, thank you for that. Polly Canning.
Hi there. Sorry, hopefully you can see me. Yes, I've been asked to speak at matter 2.2, and we seem to be talking about the realistic alternatives. So it's something I just wanted to raise, and in particular, the question you asked the council. You raised the issue to them. You kind of said the issue coming up is, are you colourblind when it comes to the issues with the AONB? And the response that we got was, well, no, we're working on a strategy that's already adopted in the local plan, and sites which had a significant amount on the AONB were dismissed early. But the council's approach is so fixed on sticking to the local plan that it doesn't consider the MPPF, which says that paragraph 171, the plan should allocate land with the least environmental or amenity value. So I'd like to ask the council where they're coming from on that angle, why the MPPF hasn't been considered there. And secondly, their other response to you was that sites which had a significant impact on the AONB were dismissed early. Now, surely a reasonable approach would have been to seek to maximise development outside areas of the district contained by the AONB designation in the first instance, before causing any harm on the AONB, however limited. So it doesn't stack up that sites and settlements outside of the AONB, such as in Sayers Common, I'm representing Mayfield Market Towns Limited, and they've been dismissed on landscape grounds when the sites that have been allocated in the AONB have been identified. There are certain sites that have been allocated in the AONB, whereas Sayers Common is not in the AONB. So in fact, the council fails to consider the reasonable and correct approach of directing growth to sites outside of the AONB in the first instance. And it's important to remember that the plan was appraised and adopted before any individual sites assessments were undertaken, the local plan. So in other words, whilst it was accepted that this strategy was delivered at a high level, this could not be confirmed until the council had completed an analysis of the individual sites and in combination with each other. Policy DP6 was therefore only intended as a guideline. Yet despite this, the sustainability appraisal has been firmly based on a fixed approach of allocating sites specifically to meet the residual settlement numbers in policy DP6 above everything else. And we don't think this is a justified approach.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Richard Barnby, sorry, Helena Griffiths, sorry. I'm sorry, I'm getting all these wrong. Sorry, I've got Judith Aston's the next one. Sorry, Judith, it's your turn.
Thank you, sir. 4 points, if I may, and I'll try not to be site specific at all. The first is the slight dichotomy there appears to be between the council's insistence that this is a daughter document that only needs to provide for the residual housing requirement set out in DP4, yet at the same time it is advocating a spatial strategy that is different to that advocated in DP6. And the SA doesn't actually assess the implications of that alternative strategy as far as compliance with the district plan and how that variance has an impact on the aims and aspirations of the district plan. The second point is in terms of the housing number, and you will have seen this in my submission, sir, but just for the record, we had set out that, in our opinion, there was a need to look at a reasonable alternative that was actually for a higher housing number than the residual requirement, because the residual requirement is a minimum requirement, because there is an issue of 5-year housing land supply and the need for a buffer, and because there is still an affordability issue in the district that needs to be addressed, and therefore it appears to us that it would have been sensible and reasonable for the local authority to assess that as a reasonable alternative. The other point, and a number of consultees have made this submission, is the way in which the SA has actually sought to assess sites and whether the assessment process was robust, justified and transparent. I've set out in my reps the concerns I have in terms of the way in which my clients' interests in Crawley Down were considered. I won't go into them again, you have them before you. And then the final point really to make is that there are, in addition, issues raised in TP3 about the fact that where insufficient sites were identified in a particular tier, allocations were made to category 1 settlements rather than look at further alternative sites within the same tier. So i.e. when you've got a tier 2 or 3 settlement site, why didn't the authority again review those instead of automatically allocating to tier 1? And in terms of their reason justification for actually dismissing sites, again, did they take on board potential mitigation? Did they take on board representations from promoters in terms of practical ways of addressing the concerns that they had? Again, you will have seen in my submissions, I'm concerned that actually in instance of my client's site interest, they did not. And clearly other people have similar views as to us on that matter. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Richard Barnby. Finally got to you.
Yeah, oh, sorry, just getting my camera on. Yeah, I'd just like to add to the argument that the sustainability appraisal isn't robust and has been inconsistent. And I agree with Mr. Lopez and Lord Lytton about the Cravick Park site insofar as it was dismissed at the early stage on what appears to be an erroneous basis, and as such was not then considered in any detail. And it also is affected by the question of the habitats assessment insofar as it's accepted that East Grinstead poses a risk to Ashdown Forest because it's in the 7-kilometre zone of influence and therefore needs mitigation. Whereas in contrast, the Cravick Park site is outside of that area and so therefore poses no threat whatsoever, according to the council's evidence. And I'd also like to go on to that to say that it appears to me from what I've seen of the evidence on the SAM that it amounts basically to collecting money and virtually nothing else. So it's unclear what it's supposed to achieve or whether it's being effective. And similarly with the SAGs, I think that's been in place for getting on for a decade. My understanding when it was put forward to start with was that it was going to be measured and monitored because it was an expected, it was expected that it would successfully divert particularly dog walkers. Now, as far as I can see, there's been no further assessment as to whether or not it's been effective or how effective it's been. Therefore, there must be a question as to whether simply extending the SAGs at East Grinstead would solve the issue at hand. And I would suggest that is against the precautionary principle.
Okay, thank you. Helena Griffiths.
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to highlight yet another example. There have been quite a few examples already shown to you of where the premature selection out of the process has actually affected the reasonable alternatives. The district, Mid Sussex, say that the process was to accept or reject sites at each stage until a pool of reasonable alternative sites could be assessed. I attest that actually the shortlisting to realistic alternatives and resultant sustainability appraisal of prospective housing sites within Horsted Canes itself has been dramatically limited prematurely, because it literally, the sites that were put forward to sustainability assessment only covered the number of houses that were needed in the village. And as a result, no true assessment of realistic alternatives have occurred. Interestingly, the realistic alternative that was actually chosen and put forward by Mid Sussex was site Schlar site 216, which is actually labelled as land at Police House Field, Birchgrove Road. You'll note that SA 28 is also labelled land south of, SA 28, land south of the old Police House Field, Birchgrove Road. The site Schlar 216 is actually a total subset, just reduced numbers of the site that has actually been allocated. So to say that it's actually a realistic alternative, it was decided that it wasn't a realistic alternative. Well, they high graded the other two sites because of the numbers, not because of a sustainability appraisal. So that sustainability appraisal has had very little effect actually on the site allocations. As I attested to in my evidence that I put forward to you earlier, I think it was 1.1, the due process, 1.1 section 2. Due process, a site that I represent, the farm buildings in site 68 in Horsted Canes. We believe that that was actually screened out. It was screened out on, firstly, incorrect information, but given it's a previously developed site in close proximity to the village, surely it should have been actually included in a sustainability appraisal. It was the only site that had been put forward as previously developed site. It was the only site that was rejected, although it was not a high impact on the high wheeled AOMB. It was rejected for access reasons, which, as I've said before, was actually incorrect information. So I contest that actually following Mid Sussex policy, there would have had to be a very compelling reason for it not to have been shortlisted at stage 3, but this is not evident by the site selection process. So stage 3 screening by Mid Sussex to reduce the sites available in Mid Sussex down to a minimum. They've only used a subset of one of the allocated sites as a realistic alternative instead of other equally sustainable sites that have been apparently filtered from the process too early. The filtering process reduced the number of sites to the point where the input to the process, so the numbers provided by the draft allocated sites, actually equated to the required output numbers. So there was no choice whatsoever to be made from the sustainability assessment going into sites in Horsted Canes and the comparison of sites in Horsted Canes. So yeah, there was no meaningful prioritisation between the sites in the village. So essentially, as it's been said before, it seems like there's a predetermined strategy that has been applied at this level within Horsted Canes. I make no comment on the high level ABC different strategies that were put forward, but on a site specific, village specific, those are my comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being brief on that. That's been helpful. I'm going to come back to the council now. Quite a few points have been made. Just summarising these, there's arguments about getting rid of sites very early in the process. Comments like irrationally kicked out or prematurely kicked out. There's been comments on inconsistency in the way the council have treated sites, and in particular sites like Haywards Heath Golf Course has come up. 1 to 5 Queen's Walk in East Grinstead is another one. Big thing, thirdly, about the Crabbit Park exclusion and the reasons for its early day kick out was the expression used there. In terms of HRA and in terms of SANGs, allegations of no monitoring. So how useful are they? Fourth point would be viability assessments. If a site is not viable, it's not realistic, therefore why is it still in? Another site that came out arguably too early was Clearwater's Farm. This whole thing about the relationship between a daughter document advocating a different spatial strategy to DP6. So at least one of you was saying that they're too close, and at least one of you was saying that in fact there was no comparison between them. And again, the premature selection point at Horsted Keynes or Keynes. So those are all points I've picked up. So do the council want to tackle these points now? Or do you want to do me a note which can be circulated and we can then get comments back?
Let's have a go while it's fresh in our minds. I'm looking at the clock and mindful of the time, so I'm hoping that everybody who wants to say anything that needs a response has already said it. So that all
right.
But anyway, so we'll see where we go. So I'm going to kick off, and I will run through the things that I can deal with, and I'll then turn over to Mr. Marsh. And can I just note at this stage that Ms. Henstock has been replaced by Jennifer Hollingham this afternoon because Ms. Hollingham has particular knowledge of issues relating to HRA. So if there's anything there that she needs to chip in with, she'll come in at the end.
Okay.
Can I start by noting the way that you phrased questions 21, 22. Is the plan supported by the SA? What evidence is there the SA has influenced the plan? And I say respectfully, I think that's absolutely the right way to put it. Supported, influenced. You will know that sustainability appraisal is not a mechanistic process which dictates the outcome of a plan. It is an information gathering tool, but there is always an exercise of judgment to be made at the end of it. And in the present case, one appreciates that there are detailed criticisms made, but if one stands back and looks at it in the legal sense in which you've asked the question, has the plan been influenced by the SA? Has the SA influenced? The answer to that is patently yes. You know what the outcome of the sustainability appraisal is. You can track that through to whether or not sites have been allocated or no. I appreciate some people may disagree with the scoring. They may say there are inconsistencies there. But so that is not the same thing at all as saying that we haven't been influenced by or supported by the sustainability appraisal. So that's the first overarching point. So the second overarching point relates to reasonable alternatives, and it is this, that when deciding what is a reasonable alternative, it's right, indeed it's necessary for the decision maker to have in mind the objectives which it is seeking to meet. An alternative which does not meet or further those objectives is not a reasonable one. And so I haven't cited you case law on that, but if you need it, I can, because it exists in an abundance. And so that point, objectives are only reasonable if they, alternatives are only reasonable if they meet the objectives, is particularly relevant to points that have been made in the last half an hour. If I start, for example, with SOFLAG and what it says about the early ruling out of sites. So one of the things that you will know, the whole purpose of this plan is to meet needs. And in order to meet needs, one of the things sites need to be before they can be allocated is deliverable. Now, in his oral comments to you, Dr. Bowes commented on site 961. I note that SOFLAG's written representations also refer to sites 327, 676. Well, sir, if you go into the site allocations document and look at the pro forma sheets for each of those sites, you will see that the answer does not turn on how they scored in terms of planning constraints or sustainability, but it turns on what is said in them in relation to deliverability considerations. And so, I mean, I wasn't entirely sure which sheet Dr. Bowes was looking at when he read to you the reasons why 961 had not been allocated, but I'm looking at deliverability on that document, and it says in terms, site not yet in control of a house builder and no time frame for delivery. Frankly, if we had allocated that site, we would be in deep trouble today if anybody said, what is your evidence that it is deliverable? And so you can track that same process through with sites 327, site 676, look up the pro forma responses. Both of those sites have serious question marks over their deliverability. We are entitled to say those are not reasonable alternatives because at the moment there is insufficient evidence that they would in fact be able to meet the need that has been identified. So that same point, alternatives are only reasonable if they meet objectives, it provides the answer to Polly Canning's point about the NPPF. Have we gone back to the NPPF? Well, in the present case, sir, the NPPF will have been taken into account when the district plan was formulated. People may like or dislike the way in which, at the end of that process, the district plan, the dice rolled, but that was a matter of examination. This is a daughter document. We are not here to say the district plan is contrary to the NPPF and therefore we can do something different. We work within the framework of the district plan. I note and I heard Judith Ashton's comments that what we are doing is not, in fact, the same as DP6. Well, so from the council's point of view, I simply don't understand or accept that. To the extent that it is possible to do it, the council believes that it has followed the settlement hierarchy in DP6. It has, wherever possible, allocated sites in accordance with, and it's worth bearing in mind that the table one has at page 37 is not part of the policy, it's an indication of where the needs arise. But to the extent that we can, we've taken that as our starting point and sought to do that. And it's only where we've been unable to identify sites in accordance with that table that we've allocated them elsewhere. And in doing that, we've gone back to the hierarchy, which is part and parcel of policy at DP6. We've sought to push it further up the line. We've gone back to what the plan says about Burgess Hill being the focus of development. So I don't accept there's any inconsistency there. Similarly, sir, objectives and reasonable alternatives, Crabbit Park. You know that the residual housing requirements that the SADPD seeks to meet is of the order of 1,200 houses. You know Crabbit Park has capacity for 2,500 houses. In simple terms, it is patently not consistent with the objectives of this SADPD. If next time we're looking at the district plan, it may be a reasonable alternative at that stage. I don't know, it may not, but it is not actually reasonable at this point. And it's something Mr. Marsh will come back to in his comments in a moment when he comments on it. And so again, this connection between objectives and reasonable alternatives directly relevant to Mr. Black's submissions, where he took you to the bit in the PPG which says, well, you should have sufficiently different alternatives for them to be meaningful, for there to be a meaningful comparison between them. And he says, well, how can that be in this case? Because all of your options have got 20 consistent sites. Well, so that criticism might have some bite to it if we were starting this process from a blank piece of paper and writing a new development plan. But that is not what we are doing. We are bringing forward a sites allocation document within the ambit of the district plan, where those key decisions, the kind of wide-ranging options with big differences between them, have already been resolved. It's been we've already narrowed down to what it is that we are looking for. And so in those circumstances, it is not surprising that there are 20 constant sites, and we're arguing about the margins on either side of that. So that's what I wanted to say in relation to reasonable alternatives. Can I go back to the second of Mr. Bowe's points on behalf of SOFLAG in relation to the way in which sites were scored at different points in the sustainability appraisal? And so I'm going to ask Mr. Marsh to deal with that in the main. But can I simply say, sir, and I do that as politely as I know how to a fellow member of the bar, the words gerrymandering carry with them an extremely serious implication, which it is surprising to hear used in this context. And so I do put down the marker that from my client's point of view, we take exception to them. We can go through, we can explain how and why we have reached the conclusions we've reached. But gerrymandering, this certainly is not. There is an exercise of planning judgment. People disagree with it. They're welcome to come forward and explain why. And so you can rule on that. But the point goes no further than that. So I'm going to turn on that basis over to Mr. Marsh and ask him to pick up on some of the more detailed points in relation to SOFLAG's objections, but also those who've spoken up subsequently that I haven't covered. Thank you.
Thank you. Just turning to the difference between option B and option C. Option B and option C, which set out in page 59. We heard from Dr. Bowes about the difference in scoring and alleged inconsistencies between the scoring, particularly on health, education, retail, I think were his key points. I would just draw your attention to the difference in scoring on objective 7 and objective 8 in particular, where option C is noticeably provides us with a more negative impact. And as we mentioned this morning, we were talking about certainly the environmental NPPF type constraints this morning, which were holding more weight than the sustainability type constraints in the site selection paper. So that's one point. The Folders Lane sites, as you probably would have noticed from your site visit, are very much in close proximity to the town centre and the railway station, and all the facilities that those provide. Those are existing facilities. The difference between the Folders Lane and Haversley Golf Course, as you note in site selection paper 3, is that the golf course was intending to provide, at their original submission perhaps, some of those facilities on site because of the size of the site. None of those facilities were agreed or indeed taken forward as part of a planning application and now withdrawn for the golf course. So there was no indication that actually those would have materialised on site. And if Dr. Bowes is suggesting that that's the only reason for us selecting Folders Lane over the golf course, that's incorrect. So that's in terms of the reasonable alternatives. I know Ms. Ashton mentioned about an option of looking at a higher housing requirement. Well, that's exactly what that exercise is doing. We recognise that option A meets our residual requirement. We could have stopped there, but council was intent on having some flexibility in the plan and looked at 2 further options, of which it settled on option B. And the reasons for that are in the essay and in the council report. It was very much a decision at council where they were provided with all that information and therefore the SA has directly influenced the final content of the plan. We heard about the justification. Why did we rule out sites in category 2 rather than category 1 for the oversupply? I think that's page 57, table 17 explains that, and also the comments that we made this morning about clearly the sites in category 1 is our most sustainable tier of settlement category, the Bree Town, so it was a sustainable justification that we would move there. I think just on going back on the filtering process, so the filtering process takes us, as we see on page 43 of the SA, figure 13, site selection paper 1, which we've heard a lot of comment about just now about how sites were ruled out. There were 2 reasons that could have rejected sites at that stage. One of them on connectivity, and that wasn't necessarily a strict scientific 150-metre buffer, as site selection paper 1 explains. That in some cases there were sites within 150 metres but were not connected because there were some sort of constraints in the way, perhaps on access or ancient woodland. I think the two examples provided amongst many. But a lot of the sites that we've heard ruled out for 150 metres, such as Crabbit Park, that wasn't the reason that site was ruled out, as Mr. Brown has already explained. That site is not consistent with the district plan strategy, DP4 and DP6, which is the starting point. So therefore, if it's not consistent with the strategy, which is the keystone of the DPD, quite rightly, we feel that it should have been rejected at its first stage, and it was. The second process, even if sites had got through that first stage, they would then have to set aside the combination of 17 criteria that we set out for housing sites in site selection paper 3, and only then where they met the methodology and that they weren't having a red impact, shall we say, against the environmental constraints, or a combination of negative impacts, which is the case in for some sites. It was ruled out at that stage, and then those that met that criteria, met the methodology, and were considered reasonable alternatives have rightly been appraised in the SA. And it's for the SA to explain the rejection at each of those stages. The detail of the rejection is in site selection paper 1 and in site selection paper 3. The SA does explain 6.25 onwards, paragraph 6.25 onwards, that it explains that should it have been ruled out in one of those papers, it was rejected in that paper. The SA explains that it was not taken forward as a reasonable alternative. So therefore, we feel we've justified in the SA that there was a filtering exercise which made its own decisions about whether they should move forward in the process, and that's part of our methodology, and that's quite clearly set out on pages 43 and 44. I think just to re-emphasise the points about Crabbit Park, I think that the points that Mr. Litton raises, he's referring to the sustainability appraisal of the district plan, which rejected that site. It hasn't made it forward as a reasonable alternative in this plan. He's referring to the district plan SA, and for reasons rehearsed during the district plan, including non-deliverability, even if it had got through site selection paper 1, it would have failed on other points of site selection in any case, particularly on the deliverability aspects.
Thank you for the 2 of you for your comprehensive response. There's a couple of points that I'm not sure you covered. One of them was a point that was made about the monitoring of, for example, the SANGs, and why you weren't doing that to see whether in fact the policy was working. And another point that was made was on viability assessments. If a site's not viable, then surely it's not realistic. I don't know if either you or Mr. Brown can answer those 2 for me. That'd be helpful.
With regard to the viability, yes, there are sites in the council's viability assessment that have been submitted that on brownfield sites, I think there are probably 4 of them that have been mentioned, that are highlighted in there. However, each of those site promoters, despite the viability, despite it suggesting that they may not be viable, each of those site promoters are promoting those sites to us, one of which is ourselves as the district council. And so we've no reason to believe that they wouldn't be brought forward in due course.
Even at a loss?
That's the viability, the high level viability assessment that's been undertaken for this plan. They've obviously done their own sums, their own work on that.
Okay. And on the monitoring? Right. Have I lost you?
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Right. Who have I got now?
This is Jennifer Hollingham. Oh, sorry.
Oh, hello.
This is Jennifer Hollingham.
Right.
Who's I indicated, so we swapped one of our witnesses around for the afternoon, and Ms. Hollingham is the expert on habitats.
Oh, right. Yes, you did. Yes, thank you for that. Well, good afternoon, Jennifer. I just want to try and understand a bit more about the effectiveness of the SANGs, because there have been a number of written responses in which claim that as a council you've not done the due process of monitoring the effectiveness of these. And if I think the rather cheeky suggestion by somebody was you're just taking the money and not seeing whether there's any value. So if you can help me in what you're doing about the monitoring of the SANGs, that would be very helpful.
Thank you. I think the first thing to say is that there is a strategic solution in place for Ashdown Forest, which is supported by and agreed with Natural England for 6 local authorities. And that is as set out in District Plan Policy DP 17, which talks about the SANG and SAM mitigation for new residential developments within the 7 kilometre zone of influence. And those 2 types of mitigation, SANG and SAM mitigation, is a similar approach to mitigation requirements at other heathland sites around the country, such as the Thames Basin Heath. It's important to remember that both the SANG and the SAM strategies are long-term strategies, and monitoring will play a part of those. And indeed, with regards to the SAM strategy, the 6 local authorities have formed a partnership and come together to work alongside the conservators of Ashdown Forest and Natural England on delivering that SAM strategy, and there's a necessary framework and governance structure in place. So monitoring will be part of those strategies.
So when you use the future tense, does that mean at the moment you're not monitoring, but you intend to very quickly?
There have been visitor survey at the current SANG, East Coast National Flats Woods, that was undertaken just prior to its implementation in 2015. And
I'm sorry, where was that, 2015?
The East Coast National Flats Woods SANG became operational in 2015. There was a visitor survey undertaken just before then. And there have also been 2 visitor surveys currently on Ashdown Forest, one in 2008 and one in 2016. And as I say, there will be more ongoing because both are long-term strategies. But needless to say, those monitoring strategies will look at the effectiveness of the mitigation, and there will be measures in place to adjust that as appropriate.
While I've got you as the expert, in my question 2.3 about adverse impacts and the recent trial, the Sweetman 2 trial that you'll know all about, I'm sure. And I asked whether there'd been any adverse effects identified that require significant mitigation. And the council has, I don't know whether you wrote this, you may have done, no adverse has been identified in the essay that requires significant mitigation. So that you've taken account of that people over wind judgment, and you're undertaking a screening for likely significant effects. You mentioned that on Ashdown Forest already. Was there anything else you wanted to mention in relation to that?
No, I don't think there's a great deal more. Just in relation to the people over wind and judgment, you'll see in our response there at paragraph 3.4, we give a summary of that in essence it means that mitigation cannot be considered at the screening stage of the HRA process, rather it is assessed at the appropriate assessment stage. So for Mid-Sussex, that Slang and Sound mitigation has been assessed at the appropriate assessment stage, and the HRA report does consider the implications of that judgment, and both recreational disturbance and air quality have progressed through to the appropriate assessment stage.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you for your contributions. It's quite late, but I think we've got two more people. If you can both be brief, then I'll listen to you and then we'll close. So Dr. Ashley Bowers first, please.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief. Firstly, allow me please to apologise to Mr. Brown's clients for any offence they took by my choice of words. That wasn't my intention, and I'm sorry for that. But secondly, we do maintain that the change in scoring is unexplained. And Mr. Marsh told you that the reason why Haywards Heath Golf Club, at least in respect of its health, education, retail and regeneration scores, was downgraded between pages 135 and then pages 59, was because as part of a planning application, all these facilities are going to be on site. And then that became clear that wasn't going to be provided, and that was the change in scoring. Well, first of all, can I just invite you at your leisure to look at 134, because that's not what's said at page 134. It's talking about existing facilities and the Haywards Heath Golf Club being within various minutes of those. And secondly, there's no explanation then as to why Folders Lane sites at page 123 are upgraded, because obviously nothing that happened at Haywards Heath Golf Club as part of a planning application could have affected the scoring of those sites. And so with the greatest respect to Mr. Marsh, that wasn't an explanation, an answer to the point that we made. And I would just draw it to your attention, so there wasn't an answer to the obvious reasonable alternative, which was the 20 constant sites scored against moderately performing sites in the other categories. You didn't get an answer on that, and I just want to draw that to your attention. Thank you for allowing me to come back, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Bowers. And John Litton.
Thank you, sir. I too will try and be very brief. In answer to Mr. Brown's point about deliverability, on large and complex sites, this of course takes many forms. It's not only legal, but there are all sorts of infrastructure and other things that have to be dealt with. Making the investment up front in all that does not readily get done if the stance of the council is fundamentally negative. And I would suggest to you, sir, that the council itself substantially influences whether a developer will bite the bullet on going ahead on a site such as Crabbit. Also, I'd like to say that although presented as a single strategic site, which indeed it was, there was no reason why it couldn't have been broken down into several bits. It was just a question of dialogue. And it's the dialogue that I don't think really happened here, despite a great deal of landowner willingness and indeed landowner cohesion, a group of people who have stuck together without a legally binding agreement between them for the best part of 18 years. I'll stop there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Right, it's been a long and full debate. I don't know if the council did want to come back on any of those late points. I'll give you a few minutes to if you want to.
So it's late in the day. I'm grateful for the invitation, but I think we'll pass. I suspect we would simply be repeating points we've already made.
Right. Okay, well, thank you for today. And we will, don't forget, tomorrow we start at 9:30 in the morning. Thank you very much. We're now closed.